Alright everyone, welcome back to the show Mandala. Mandala, this is the most special of the Mandala episodes yet. You know who I was able to secure? I mean, maybe at an odd point in their life, but can you believe I'm sitting with Robert Kreisgau right now?
Hello.
Like, it's just unbelievable, and at the most interesting phase of your life thus far, recently you've decided to come out and you've tarnished Bruce Springsteen, tarnished the New York Dolls, tarnished the kind of sunnier, happier tracks of Thelonious Monk, and you've gone full goth. Your hair's your silver hair's been dyed black there, and the albums you've recommended for this show are completely different to what I may have expected, I must say.
It all started when I bought my first turtleneck, and from there it just put a melancholic lather over my soul, and so therefore I got into good music.
Yeah, they ought to write that on the tag somewhere, next to the don't wash with certain colours, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and as well on the music they should put a parental advisory sticker on anything that's nihilistic.
Yeah, it could cause a certain existential condition which doesn't remove itself unless one decides to become stupidly, shamelessly, and amorally wealthy, which is probably not the best thing to do either.
Yeah, and writing words for magazines about music doesn't get you that wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, it can get you notoriety, but sometimes, unfortunately, long after it was deserved. Anyway, I was highly impressed with these choices here. A depressing selection of interesting sonics,
Yeah.
and it was telling. Some of them affected you to a degree that you sound like a Australian male in their mid-20s now instead of some New York socialite, pseudo-sophisticated wannabe beat critic.
Well, it's the most pseudo-sophisticated socialite sort of sycophantic move possible, right? Do something no one else is going to do. I got the idea initially from Robert Downey Jr. in that movie, where he's an Australian actor.
Oh, Tropic Thunder?
Yeah.
I remember that.
If you know the reference, you know the reference.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of put this sort of black stain on my soul.
Yeah, fascinating. And I'm very curious to hear your particular thoughts and musings upon the releases I've recommended as well. And so we're going to start with, and I'll preamble, of course,
Yeah.
Harold Groskopf's Synthesis. If I'm playing this for someone, I get the impression that if
you should be glad I've gone through this change, because if it hadn't happened, then
I know it gets a bomb or a gun,
I would have given it just
or a crucifix or something.
All your
yeah.
anti-commercial music, I would have given a stupid symbol.
Yeah, no Berlin School for the Pos and Jap poll.
Instead, today I'll be giving deep anecdotes.
Harold Groskopf's Synthesis sounds like something which would be a major soundscape in a new age release by the mid 80s. But in 1980, this sort of thing was literally unheard of. Certainly in the English speaking world, if you're in the know and in certain scenes in Germany, you may have been very well aware of this kind of music. But this is a scale possibly even unprecedented by that, compared to the thin but very luminous layers of Tangerine Dream. Those records, and as well as Kraftwerk's, did have some presence in the English speaking world, though not overwhelmingly significantly compared to the likes of Popcorn or the synth-fax of the later 70s and early 80s. Synthesis by Groskopf, it's entirely instrumental. It almost feels like a freeform jazz jam in its composition, although I suspect there is more of a keen structure to it. It almost functions as soundtrack / library music, although really it's getting at the pathology of what those long-form dance tracks... It's not dancey. Dance music in 1980 meant disco, so it's not in that world. And it's not quite in that high-energy world either, which is still very disco / funk adjacent. This is getting to that world where it's closer to... It's like slow-paced trance music.
Yeah.
It's ahead of its time in a particular respect. It's so 80s in its sonics, although in terms of wanting to compose these 6 to 7 minute, 5 minute tracks where we have these kind of cycles, foreshadowing of the next pattern that's going to occur. It's a sort of method of composition which feels ubiquitous to more 90s electronic soundscape environment. And the reason I wanted to pick Synthesis today is because I think it's an example of an album that sounds phenomenally 80s, and the fact that it came out in 1980 itself rather than the later in the decade is astonishing. I think that would surprise people, including those from the decade and those who are in the know.
It's right on the cusp, yeah. Because elements of it are like you compared to Tangerine Dream, like irrevocably 70s.
Yes.
But like you mentioned, it's also takes a next step further than even say something like Low, where it's more resembles a 90s soundscape.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. And I think the world you're thinking of as well is, I feel this has got one sort of like foot in synth pop, you know?
Yeah.
Because in the sort of, bleepy, bloopy, early, like late 70s, early 80s synth pop before it became more like new wave and very
sort of
commercialized.
beige, adult
Yeah.
Spandau Ballet sort of 80s.
Sure, you can name a million, yeah.
That's true. So.
But the between those little like moments of synth pop, it'll be like mostly like big washes of like immense sounding synthesizer landscapes, you know.
Yeah.
So that's what it is for the most part. I guess it's been like labeled as a progressive electronic these days.
Yes.
That sort of genre. Because there's a million of these progressive electronic albums.
Yeah, like Pythagoras, their album came out the same year, and that's quite a favorite of mine.
Yeah. There's so many, and like a bunch
really
of them,
stuff. Yeah.
no one's ever heard of.
No.
Like very few people, you know.
Yeah,
And
until the internet age, really.
They're all pretty great, though. This one is like definitely a classic amongst them. It's like it's up there as one of the best, easily.
I think it's one of the most interesting albums of the '80s, in that you thoroughly appreciate that it sounds of its era. Like, sometimes the 80s seems to be a decade where people are less forgiving of, or more forgiving in some respects, maybe, in the other side of the coin, of, there's a certainly where music is concerned, lack of willingness to conceive that some of this music can be timeless because of the very particular production tropes of the time. And yet, I think this is one where the production tropes are fully enforced, but not in a commercial respect. And perhaps that's the key there, where we just see sort of the artful sort of this sound test of everything that's possible within the technology before it gets all kind of processed and dumbed down in the corporate machine.
Sure.
And Howard Groskopf is worth mentioning. The groups that he was part of initially was the Astro Temple / Ashra, and then as a result he also appears on the Cosmic Jokers recordings, which were maybe with or without their permission. That's kind of a controversial area, but those recordings are fucking awesome. Just for those who don't know, the Cosmic Jokers recordings, some members of these groups such as Ashra Temple were jamming on certain psychoactive substances at a certain certain venue.
He's another guy. Gotching.
Yeah. No, this makes me think of like an earlier version, but the other version of E2E4 is guitar oriented. His famous 84 release, as I said, E2E4. But no, Cosmic Jokers, that these gigs jam sessions were recorded and released, and there was the musicians weren't happy about that either, because it was done without the recordings done without their permission. I don't know if they were going to be sold without the group's permission and people weren't going to get paid or not, but I think one way or the other, they didn't want the recordings distributed. Whether they were going to get paid for it, I don't know.
Okay. Because
I don't think that the payment was I think they were willing to pay people. I'm not sure. Because if they weren't, that's even more fucked up. And is kind of the more pressing issue. I mean, fair enough if you don't want your recordings out there, but I kind of respect the artists, although I've listened to the music a lot and enjoyed it, so I'd be a hypocrite to stand aside with the artist.
Sure.
Said.
Yeah, well, it all depended on the sort of sleazy contracts they'd have back then, you know.
Yeah. I think it may have been well-meaning. I'm not sure. It's not exactly like their commercial records. It's like they're these cult records. You know what I mean?
Sure,
they're not exactly a niche audience. So that's kind of anyway.
Yeah.
They'd be for collectors and hobbyists. Maybe it was more a vibrant sort of viable, commercially
in Germany,
profitable scene at that time. But no, I consider this one of the Howard Groskopf Synthesis one of the more interesting records of its kind, or in the 1980s in general, and it's an example of where we see the best things that that decade gifted to music history, rather than the sort of things that the 90s were trying to desperately scrub off, let's say, certainly in sort of that's sort of the popular narrative, at least in the sort of, you know, a mainstream, or at least rock context. Absolutely. Electronic music at that time seems to, I mean, the technology changes, it goes into a sort of different direction. You get the trip hop era in the UK, and all the EDM sort of brings a character of its own, distinct from the previous decade. And that's sort of the other genre that really takes off, though it's influenced by 80s acts like, you know, that the sort of big R&B and hip hop movement, obviously in debt to Michael Jackson slash, you know, the 80s hip hop pioneers like Run DMC and Public Enemy, NWA, etc.
Sure,
respectively. Yeah. But they can add a certain character that was sonic character that was distinct from the prior, the infamous decade. And I'll throw it over to you for a while, I suppose, if you like, and then I'll round out my thoughts on Harold Groskopf with Synthesis here. So
yeah.
Go ahead if you like.
Yeah, well, like I was saying, this album stands on, like, the shoulders of a really cool scene that, yeah, I think, like, I wasn't there, but I think it was a very vibrant scene, just from what I've, like, the sort of people who comment on obscure albums on YouTube, it typically, like, there's a lot of people from, like, France and Central Europe, like Germany and various other, you know, Central European countries. It seems like they just love this sort of stuff. Like, it was because it was music that, you know, for one, like you were saying, it's not commercial, so there are no vocals on it. It's a purely instrumental album, and so it's sort of, you know, it's just appreciated as music itself, not as this sort of, like, you know, pop cultural moment or something like that.
Fad, yeah.
And it's more like the moment it occupies, like you were explaining, is for, like, these sort of tech heads, right?
Yeah.
They want to hear what the tech can do and where we're going with all this, you know, new hardware and as well as, like, you know, most of these people that were making these albums were like classically trained.
Yeah.
And they're sort of taking that craft and utilizing it with all the sort of up-to-date tech and stuff. And so, yeah, like I was saying, there's like thousands of these albums that are really great. Like another guy that no one seems to know, some guy called Ralph Ludson. I think he's Swedish. But yeah, Manuel Gotching, there's so many. But this is one that, like, does stand out amongst, like, the thousands of really good ones. This is, like, easily within the top echelon of this style of music. It's such a, like you were saying earlier, perhaps, like, some of the production, like, you know, synthesizer sounds can be a bit dated, or I even said the bleep blops. But so much of it is just timeless, and so much of this music is sort of transcends its place. It like I was saying, it does draw from the 70s. When I was listening to it again recently for the show, I was like, man, this is the album that I feel Rick Wakeman wished he could have made.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, this kind of moves the Rick Wakeman sort of ocean of key sounds into this newer territory with, like, the purely electronic, you know, non sort of symphonically inclined, you know.
Yeah. There'll be, like, curious percussions and things like that on the album too. Like, it has that's actually one of its most interesting aspects, probably, is how it mixes in those, like, sort of washes of Rick Wakeman-esque, you know, maximal synth droning with, like, sort of like off-kilter disco, you know, sort of dance beats that are... That's probably how it's very ahead of its time, you know, because it's preceding things like hip-hop and trip-hop, with its use of percussion and, like, yeah, just sort of, like, strange percussive sonics, similar to, like, something like Freak Folk will do, you know.
But, you know, elements where we could claim that the album is dated, I think I would claim that these are sort of circumstantial, and the album makes us realize that these things is interesting developments or ideas rather than evidence of technological adolescence of sorts. And I think that what you have on on the record is sort of yeah, as I said, sort of the ultimate creative statement of that era's sonic techno aesthetic.
Yeah, or even pre-techno. That you know.
I mean, techno that's my me combining technology and
Right.
aesthetic, and because in the same sort of word. Not techno's in the music genre,
Which is probably where they got the name for the genre. Yeah.
well, naturally, yeah.
But this is sort of preceding techno in a very fascinating
Definitely,
way,
yeah. Insofar as, I mean, what was the first of these genres to emerge out of disco is house, right? Which then techno kind of derives from.
Yeah,
initially.
maybe high energy.
Yeah, high energy is
'Cause
the
that's
original,
right
so
at the
yeah,
time.
high energy then post disco, of
And
course.
then house. I think house probably comes from high energy. They're like, oh, let's slow it down a bit,
Yeah, yeah.
Because high energy is very, very. It's high energy.
Yeah, I think house music sometimes doesn't get the discussed in the history of sort of, maybe in some circles, but like in the history of like kind of interesting musical development is sort of just like, because I think house is like seen by like a lot of people who seem to listen to house like only listen to house and they kind of fuck everything else off. so house is like place in music history is sort of like they don't, like people who like house music don't give a fuck about Kraftwerk. They couldn't give a fucking shit about Kraftwerk, and so I think people kind of see house as this genre that sort of wanted to just fuck everything else off and start of just reduce
Maybe
music
like
to
populist house music.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I
yeah.
mean, though.
Because house music peaked.
not
in-
DJs as such.
Yeah, DJs always talk up Kraftwerk because it's sort of you have to. You have to know it before
Point,
you can
yeah.
DJ. Even like Swedish House Mafia have to know what that is.
Yeah, so someone told them they had to do that. Yeah,
Yeah, within probably some music school they went to or something.
exactly.
But
yeah.
but yeah, the sort of house music peaked commercially with that EDM wave in the late 2000s, early 2010s.
Oh yeah. Fuck.
And so it was like really popular at one point. That sort of just died off, I suppose. Like when anything reaches the pinnacle, it doesn't stay there forever.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of fans of like underground club music, donk, and like
Very
down
true.
tempo
Very very
stuff,
true. Yeah.
who like will champion certain house labels and things like that. It's a niche audience, but it does exist. But it's not like the popularity of the mainstream EDM was at the time.
Yeah. Because like in that sort of like alt sort of like, you say the music we were into when we were at late adolescence, sort of alt sort of enemy world of like, we're into like Sonic Youth and Minutemen and like all this sort of like the Smiths and all those sort of groups. Like
I still love all that music.
No, me too. I do all that stuff, but like to us, like we saw house music as like trash in a way. We were just like because we were just like. Because it wasn't in that narrative. It wasn't in that world.
Yeah. Well,
but disco was kind of getting into that world because of the Daft Punk thing happened recently.
Well, and house music isn't stoner music either. It's club music and
talk more of the context, yeah,
and chem music, So that's naturally how something like that would happen. But yeah, like I think the other thing is like house music has so many splinters and subgenres. There's a niche within a niche where like people champion specific subgenres of house. Like I love acid house, for example.
Oh, who does?
Which is so specific. Like it's derivative of house
it is.
music, but it's its own genre in a way, just by its variation. And there's a million of those. Like,
and then like acid house had like a life of its own in the UK. You know what I mean? Like distinct from its American. I mean, all the American songs were the hits over there.
Yeah. Acid house sort of.
Just how it influenced the baggy world. Like just it became like it's like acid house became like almost comparable to its like parent genre in terms of influence.
Yeah.
Sort of splinter fashion.
Yeah, and that'll happen for a bunch of different house genres, So many. Like, the one I mentioned earlier is what they call progressive house. I'm like, okay, I guess it's progressive. I'm not sure how, but fair enough.
Probably something to do with the nitty gritty of the compositional factors. But, but that, that all being said, it all orbits around this, discussion we're having of a particularly brilliant release. And I wanted to mention the rest of Groskopf haven't released he only has one other album in the 80s called Ocean Heart, which I haven't spent much time with, but it had sort of a different direction. It was more of a, I think it's a more sparse piece, I would say.
Yeah.
And then I don't find it as compelling, at least personally. and then the albums in the 90s, only a couple in the 90s and a couple in the 2000s. He does Synthesis 2010, and Synthesis Reloaded in 2018. So he's kind of, that's still sort of his remembered solo work.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it's like, to me, some of this other stuff seems fascinating to a point, absolutely. But Synthesis is just the one that when I started it, I had to keep going, and I've always remembered as like, that's one of the best things I've ever heard. And I need to kind of really stamping it in my memory by picking it here and hoping you all find some joy from it also.
Yeah, it's a very lovable album. It's easy to enjoy, like, which is like, for as good as some of this progressive electronic European stuff is, some of it is pure abstract.
Yeah,
whereas
sure.
this is very, very, like, it's the sort of thing that draws you in straight away. You know, it's that fascinating.
Yeah, I say to anyone who's skeptical of these 80s tropes in general and doesn't see it as them as sophisticated, go listen to this one and find out what potentially could have been of this decade's cliches musically, if it were not for big business kind of getting their claws into the soup and spilling it everywhere and ruining it for everyone, spoiling it. Now, in the same room, this kind of punishment.
Yeah, this is definitely not big business.
You thought I was starting some new sentence, but it's actually the name of the artist and album.
Yeah, it's this kind of punishment in the same room. 19, I don't know, late 80s.
87.
87, yeah. And it's right on the precipice of the 90s, and it's weird that, like, there's a few...
Well, 3 years before the 90s, I know it is very ahead of the curve on a few things, or at least, like, these New Zealand guys had these ideas which we independently picked up later. I don't know if these got anywhere.
It's so fascinating how it works, like, even just on a basic level musically, but on a weird, like, anthropological level as well, I suppose.
Of course, yeah.
Because Australia was similar with it sort of, you know, preceding popular 90s American music.
The feed time thing, yeah.
Yeah, feed time. There's heaps of them.
People say the Scientists as well.
Yeah.
That's a bit more dubious to me, but I can kind of...
I think it's because Kurt Cobain sided the Scientists.
Yeah, I think he did like them. I'm sure that's...
And so that's how that's sort of extrapolated, which is the same as feed time.
But Kirk strikes me as the kind of guy who just say that, like, knowing that the music world will kind of just run with it, and, like, wouldn't that be funny? Because there's this thing where, I remember when Nardwuar was interviewing him, Nardwuar brings up the Sonics, and Kurt's just like, no, I hate the Sonics. Like, he's supposed to start shit, and you hear Courtney go, no, you love the Sonics, Kurt.
Yeah.
Because, you know, Kurt's just, like, sick, he's
just
like, sick of it.
Interview as well, yeah.
Yeah, he's just eating pizza at the time. He's kind
sure,
of, like,
yeah.
After a gig.
That was the whole style of that era, like just shooting the shit and being ironic.
Yeah, just like, I'm gonna like say this like provocative thing, I have to take off.
Yeah, yeah.
Because everyone knows like he said the Sonics before or whatever. And
yeah, it was probably in some
people
magazine.
saying that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All the interviewers keep asking him. But yeah, no, this I was thinking about it earlier today actually, because it's weird that in such isolation these Kiwi guys sort of came up with songwriting ideas that, like, you know, this album is like full of all the sort of like acclaimed Ameri indie stuff from the 90s, all those tropes. Like, you'll hear a little bit of Slint in there.
Yeah.
You know, you'll hear a little bit of like slowcore.
Yeah.
You'll hear a bit of like post-hardcore. And I think it all comes from, like, these people who... For one thing, I think this group must have been the only people in New Zealand at the time who had a This Heat record. Because, like, the opening track has an interesting sort of... The same vocal thing that they do, this weird, like, deep-throated drone. Almost like it's, you know, the Tuvan throat singing. But then, I think all this sort of came out of... like an appreciation for things like the Velvet Underground and you know, sort of like proto-punk, like the Modern Lovers and the Stooges, and like sort of, I guess the sort of Syd Barrett sort of, you know, I don't know if his solo albums were widely available in New Zealand, but like so much New Zealand music sounds like the Syd Barrett solo albums, especially the second one, more so than the first. But because that second Sid Barrett album sounds like a slacker rock album. It's very interesting like that.
Yeah, we know that these Barrett era Floyd, and I assume those albums as well, the two solo LPs, were popular in the American indie rock world in the Midwest. You know, Athens, Georgia, like that's sort of a famous citation by those groups.
Yeah, they're probably getting it from similar sources. Yeah. But then just because of perhaps it's the pure isolation, or as the story goes, it's like a local scene where everyone, it's like a sort of tight knit community, and they're all like egging each other on to sort of like outdo each other and things like that, or like just get anyone to
sound different,
Yeah, just to get anyone to come to the show,
Have a gimmick, yeah, almost, yeah.
And so, this album, like every song on it is weird, out there, interesting, but then strangely like sort of melodic. They'll throw in like interesting little like pop sensibilities in with the like most avant-garde sort of noise blues sort of strange like experimentations.
Yeah.
Like there's just so much variety on this album that it's just coming from like a lo-fi, fairly like modest garage recording, yet they're able to, I suppose similar to Martin Newell, just put interesting little flares and touches in there with how they'll mix in layers of guitar and stuff like that. So for a lo-fi job, it's quite like impactful and sort of subtle. It's like open to lots of re-listening.
It sounds like the Dunedin Sounds No Wave album.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Because the little pop sensibility Dunedin things will come in, but then it'll sound like no wave, or sort of that sort of weird out there New York stuff. But then also because they mix in a bunch of other sort of weird influences like strange folk and things like that, it almost feels like slowcore and things like that. I probably listened to this album. I came across it just randomly, maybe like 6 months ago.
Oh yeah.
And it's like quickly become one of like my favorites of that whole Kiwi arc.
Mm-hmm.
It's and they're sort of like, they were veterans of the scene. They're in a early punk band called the Nocturnal Projections, which are pretty cool as well.
Well, this is their third album anyway, right?
And this is their third album, yeah. I've heard the one before it, which is pretty good, but I haven't heard the first one. So there's more for me to check out on this band. But yeah, this album is like, I don't know why. I guess I would have just come across this album. That's how I would have found the band, and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. And I listened to it and I was like pretty blown away.
I rather liked this. This is very, very cool stuff. Doesn't outstay its welcome. You can, the cover art there kind of gives you an idea of what you're in for, and if that's if that image is a sell for you, won't be disappointed whatsoever. Really cool stuff. These guys were clearly very creative, and it's always amazing to me how much ferocious creativity there was in that New Zealand music scene, because sometimes it feels like there wasn't an individual pocket of the Australian music scene that seemed to produce a lot of similarly interesting music at that time. I feel like I'm not as educated enough in that being said. I don't know where the Australia's East Coast's Dunedin scene is. I guess a lot of our bands are trying to be commercial or big in America.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Especially in Sydney and Melbourne. That's why you get something like the Go-Betweens, or the later band I'll bring up from like Brisbane,
Oh, yeah. And the Saints are from Brisbane, obviously.
And the Saints, yeah.
It's fascinating how these things turn out.
Because definitely the Sydney and Melbourne bands were hyper-commercial.
Well, right now, one of the more interesting scenes operated in terms of these sort of East Sydney / Melbourne sounding bands, the fun scene was operating out of Canberra of all places here. No Canberra bands expect to be super big. They're just happy to be big in Canberra. You can have sort of a local economy, sort of keep a modest income going.
Because there's nothing to do, so it's a place to hang out as well. Probably similar to what it was like in New Zealand.
Can't have too many adults at the Questacon. That would just be obnoxious for all the excursions. And and also, I mean, the Melbourne scene's not some credit to the Melbourne scene. Some of those bands are, if they're trying to be popular, it's within a certain niche world of like snooty internet magazines, which is the kind of music I like, so I don't mind. You know, whatever.
Sure.
They're trying to sound like Total Control or what was the other group? Forget. I can't think of them right now. No, not them. Yeah, moving on. I'll think of them later, hopefully.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, New Zealand groups, good stuff. And New Zealand still produces good music sometimes. I was thinking recently about a group that's had all their albums so far been very good, at least, and that's Unknown Mortal Orchestra.
Yeah.
I might talk about some of their work someday. I like their stuff.
Yeah, they're sick.
Good on you, gentlemen. And are we overlooking anything to more to share for in the same room here?
No, it's a sort of like all these albums I've picked are sort of fairly abstract and strangely melancholic and gothic, so they do sort of speak to a particular experience, best interpreted by oneself. So, you know, I'll be fairly brief with just like describing the albums and stuff, and just saying like, yeah, check them out if anyone's watching.
The band I was thinking of, the Melbourne band, I don't think it was this band I was thinking of, but King Gizzard are from Melbourne, for example, and that's sort of, you know, aiming for a niche audience rather than the sort of like, you know, what something like Wolfmother was just aiming for. Wolfmother weren't from Melbourne though, I
think they're from Sydney.
Yeah, as I was assuming. And frankly, I think some of the Perth bands are trying to aim for a certain international sort of. I mean, I don't know how much international world it's like Perth was 10 years behind in like the early 2010s when like after the presets and Pinal was kind of done.
Yeah,
it's sort of interesting.
Well, yeah, Perth's a different country.
Sorry, Perth. So I got a commenter from Perth. I'm sorry to that guy. No, he's fun. High Seas. Yeah, seen him on the High Seas.
Pavement have a song about how great Perth is, so they've got that.
Yeah, not every city has a song from Pavement about it. There you go.
Oh,
there's only so many Pavement songs.
Yeah, and it's rare for a band to write a song about Perth, so it is kind of interesting.
Good on you guys, especially a band that's not from Perth.
Yeah.
At least. Anyway, I'm going to be discussing next. This is an English artist, although he's most prominent. His biggest influence is not in the UK, it's in Australia.
Oh,
Brian Bennett.
Probably.
Brian Bennett, the unsung genius. Brian Bennett was the drummer for The Shadows. And then he decided that he'd go move on to compose library music, a lot of it for this Bruton music label in the 1970s. And it's some of the more interesting music you'll ever hear. His disco album, Discoid Funk, is one of the best LPs. There's not a lot of like really classic disco LPs. It's usually about the singles. Even the famous Donna Summer double LP, like that wears. I like disco, but even that wears a little thin.
Yeah,
good album though.
That's a very abstract disco album as well. It's like like a symphonic prog meets disco.
It's a bit like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road or one of those things.
Sure, yeah.
That's a good album, to be fair. And the great disco LP of that period, like proper, is like it came out after Disco Demolition Night, I think, like in '79, so it wasn't as successful, and she wasn't as big until a bit later. But Grace Jones Muse, like that's just pitch perfect. Like it's that's better than Off the Wall. It's better than Donna Summer. Better than the Chic albums. Like
sure,
the Chic albums are more inconsistent than people I think will.
Sure.
I've mentioned a couple of those singles, like The Freak and Good Times are kind of boring. But anyway, Brian Bennett. I think the Brian Bennett album I wanted to and / Bruton Music release I wanted to bring up here today is Nature Watch. Well, yeah, briefly, do you want to specifically mention Brian Bennett's influence on the Australian continent?
Yeah, man, New Horizons. That is the song. If you play New Horizons for any Australian that watched television for 30 or 40 years, they'll know it straight away. I guess that's its impact. Like, it sort of was ingrained in a fairly large portion of Australian society because it was the theme song to like Channel 9's coverage of the cricket. So it was such an amped way to open a broadcast. It was like you hear all the music pieces that are used as like hype music for sporting events, and it's easily the best one that's ever existed. Like I think it's not just like a weird like endearment factor amongst cricket fans. It seems to be like fairly objectively like tipped to as being this like amazing, beautiful piece of music composition.
Yeah.
And it's just a shame they don't use it anymore because it's very impactful, especially for something as sort of, you know, trivial as sports broadcasting.
Yeah.
To have something so like ethereal and like triumphant and properly like it should be the Australian national anthem.
Yes, I agree.
I
totally agree.
It would be the best world national anthem. That's how good it is, a piece of
Yeah,
music.
we don't need to sing it when we have to stand up.
Yeah,
we don't have to remember the lyrics.
Just instrumental as well.
And our home can still be girt by sea. That's all fine. But people won't know what the word girt means anymore. They're not going to teach it in school if they're no longer teaching our Advanced Australia Fair.
That's a weird thing with the Australian anthem. It was written like deliberately. You know, what's the word for when something's out of time again?
Outdated.
No, you know when they say it exists.
Antiquated.
Not antiquated. There's I forget what it is, but you know it's they were using deliberately archaic words to sort of harken back to early Australian, like, you know, folk songs and stuff.
Sure.
The sort of words they use in those. So it was deliberately like anachronistic. That was the word I was
got you. Yeah.
Because it was written in the 50s or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So they were using like, you know, deliberately using older words.
Yeah, when we first learned, we're under the impression it's from like, God, the 19th century or something.
Yeah. I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure.
No. I think you're correct.
I'm pretty sure it was a 20th century invention.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, definitely. Brian Bennett is weirdly influential in Australia.
Mm.
And I guess England really like Cliff Richard and The Shadows.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, no.
But this extension of his career through the 70s and 80s is the real juice through Bruton, I guess. Please take it away.
I was going to mention like the Shadows are influential enough. Like I think there's, insofar as like the Shadows were the model of the British rock bands and including the Beatles, there's this claim that the Shadows are more influential in music history than people can take for granted at face value even. As like the kind of the first prototypical rock band as we know them.
Sure. Yeah, didn't you once say that John Lennon said there was no good English music to like Cliff Richard?
That's what he thinks, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously his mate Paul thinks differently because he likes all the early 20th century music hall stuff. It's down by the seaside and all that.
That song Summer Holiday came on like the radio the other day.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, man, John Lennon must have loved this song because it's like he kind of just like took so much from that style of songwriting.
Yeah. Yeah, Summer Holiday. I think the film for that I think it was, I don't know if it was tied into a film or the film came out afterward, but that's like, yeah, British director Peter Yates' first films, and he later did Krull.
Oh wow. Director of Summer Holiday.
Peter Yates, I'm pretty sure. As opposed to who's the other Peter? Anyway, but Brian Bennett on Nature Watch. This is his ambient release, and it's my favorite of the Brian Bennett solo albums that I've heard, along with Discoid Funk. But this is the most beautiful sort of library, sort of like sitting in a nice a room with a comfortable temperature, and there's glass walls, and you're overlooking like a garden, and there's moisture around. This is Serenity on a disc or on a upload of it of a disc in a digital format, in the way we're listening to it now. This is how I'm going to sell ambient music to people, because I find this to be an album that would be so easy to just move people and sort of like get them in a good space with this album. And it's not like that sort of like, you know, spacey, you know, woo sort of ambient music. It's not the sort of, you know, new agey sort of like crystal ambient music. It's not that kind of you know, depressing sort of drone, like, you know, let's get to the depths of the soul and find the you know, the superstructure of the reptile brain. You know, it's not nothing like that. It's just pure Garden of Eden, but unpretentiously so. Without in the Garden of Eden in a more well, I say secular sense, but like all cross irreligious, you know, which is to say it's comfortable to religious.
It's new age.
Also.
Like you said, it wasn't new age, but the soundscapes fall in line with new age, but the philosophy of the album is definitely new age. Like you said, secular, new age in the sense of this sort of reappropriating of world mysticism, through the lens of appreciation of nature.
Mm.
So that's why I think this sort of ambience, it's definitely trying to evoke a sort of appreciation of nature as a spiritual exercise, right? Which is where it, like the music itself, the ambience is a bit more like minimal.
Yes.
You know, it's got elements of minimalism in it, and then a lot of repetition. But I feel it's going for a new age sort of thing. Even the name of the album, you know, very new age.
Given the label Bruton Music and that's library of music, I suspect that this is the sort of thing which they anticipated would be purchased and used in, say, documentaries from the BBC.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of like, and it's so telling that this music was used and it was put together for that purpose, because that kind of wannabe utopian documentary world, you know, that sort of post-war consensus, this is how everything works, this is the majesty of the world, let's categorize it all, sort of post-empire fashion. And it's and that world, that sort of like, you know, like schoolboy in a rainy day watching a documentary about like, you know, the seasons changing and the fauna of the dense African Serengeti to music like this. I mean, it's such a beautiful, optimistic, blissful world, and I guess it's a shame about the next 10 years in the country, the economic crisis or you know, everything else. But these sort of temporal spaces of brief, beautiful tranquility, you can learn about them and that they existed and how they're attempting to better construct that sort of mental space via artifacts such as Nature Watch by Graham Bennett. And to me, it evokes that sort of what I really like about that British post-war aesthetic. That sort of like how there was a sort of optimistic, like post fear of God sort of like secular pantheism of that David Attenborough school, and that's what I really adore about that era. And
well, they stopped fearing God and they started fearing man, and maybe that's where the appreciation of nature and the sort of like taxonomy of all things in the documentarian sense comes into it. Because you know, after the Second World War, there was reason to fear man existentially because of nuclear weapons, and you know, global tension throughout the rest of the century, essentially.
Yes.
But this album is definitely of that era, and I guess Bruton are like a British library music thing. Because there's another classic Brian Bennett album that I've heard is just pretty good. I forgot, it's called like Chase Music or something, and there's like a car on it, and it's like jazz funk, and it sounds like the typical sort of like cop chase, you know, 70s television show music. But it's still so like beautifully made. Like Brian Bennett, that's his genius. He goes into like all these different styles of music and can make this like these beautiful compositions out of it. Like he's so versatile, and he's a drummer as well. So that it's interesting how a drummer has such an ear for arrangements and stuff. Because New Horizons is like, you know, a strange like I don't even know what you'd call that. Some sort of like classical piece. I don't know if what's style or
in Australia it was initially used for a cop show. A short-lived
that
cop
was used
show,
for
right?
a cop show. Yeah, I don't think one that lasted too long. But it's mostly well known as the Cricket. But yeah, I think the same network used it, Channel 9.
Yeah.
For the cop show.
Okay.
But then I guess they repurposed it for the Cricket. It suits the Cricket more than a cop show, definitely.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is there was a compilation from 2014, Drama Montage.
Yeah, Drama Montage.
Yeah, that takes some of his 70s library music, puts it into one disc. Because I wasn't familiar with it, but I see it.
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with a release of a car on it, but here it is.
Oh, yeah, it was released in the 70s, but the album with the car on it is the...
Yeah, no, the music's from the 70s.
They released it as two different albums in the 70s, or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's...
But the comp is... got the car.
Yeah, the two drama montages,
Yeah,
Bruton music's really interesting. I love that sort of world. A lot of good artists work for Alan Hawkshaw, Francis Monkman, who was formerly the keyboardist of Curved Air, the very good prog, and I think a little bit underrated, well, probably not now. It's the internet. Everyone knows everything now. Hopefully, prog group. I don't know if I'm forgetting anyone from Bruton Music, but if I am, I apologize, because I've heard some really quality, interesting stuff from them. And when I think of I'm not really someone who keeps track of record labels, but when I think if someone asks me what record labels I like, because Bruton's one of the ones that comes to my just they're necessarily one that I've paid attention to because of so much music I like comes specifically from them. It's all the same mission statement essentially. So Bruton Music's one of the first record labels that really comes to my mind, especially because what am I going to name one of these stupid catch-alls that just distributes all this crap? No. But there's another record label I like, which we're going to get to later, which has a vaguely similar philosophy, though less, not that this is commercial music, but it was intended for, say, educational purposes. Music that was in this later label intended for maybe even vaguely philosophic intents, and that'll be an interesting discussion, far more interesting than the conversations you have in your day-to-day life when people have there's nothing to really, there's so much to discuss in this universe: the history of philosophy, the output of music and culture in the 21st century, all of these major world-changing global events occurring on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it all sounds lovely.
But people just... What do they want to talk about?
I want to talk about
the weather.
Because that is what Englishmen do. And in all great Englishman tropes, this is definitely the gloomiest music I've ever heard.
Isn't this the kind of, what other English band of this period do you think would sooner pass as a German band to someone who didn't know better?
Yeah.
Or European band.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this does have that sort of German industrial sort of sound.
Maybe if you played a certain, Test Department song and you didn't, because there's no vocals on it, you'd be like, this is one of those German acts.
They're a bit easier.
I think you do hear a bit of, there are some Test Department songs, such as the infamous statement of the minor Alan Peasdale.
Yeah.
Which obviously that's in English,
Yeah.
In other instances, there could be anyone, any nation. Carry on. Go.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I forget what city these guys come from, but there was a scene of this sort of music in that city. The most popular band is something called
Leeds, West Yorkshire.
Leeds, okay. Yeah, apparently the most popular band was Sisters of Mercy.
Oh, sure.
They seem to be more famous.
Yeah, the big goth band, yeah.
But I guess the similarity is these sort of bands would use drum machines.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a bit death rock as well.
Oh yeah, like Alien Sex Fiend.
Yeah, that sort of school of thing. Because they would mix in this gloomy sort of cascading wall of sound guitar stuff with strange drum patterns on a drum machine.
Yeah.
Maybe all these bands are sort of influenced by Suicide.
Oh yeah,
It seems kind of downstream of that sort of thing.
They were brilliant,
yeah. Yeah, but mixing Suicide sort of minimal percussion, drum machine with I don't know, Susie and the Banshee sort of style, cascading angular post-punk guitar.
Yeah.
But then these guys are a bit more, they do all that, but it's a bit more sort of gritty as well. It almost feels like the sort of the Martin Hannett production sort of thing, just done very cheaply. Where it's that weird sort of cavernous, you feel like you're in the club while they're playing this album live, It's just sort of full of these, very sort of punchy, dark sort of post-punk extrapolations. And they're all just similar to the best of this sort of music, this sort of style of gothic death rock downstream of post-punk is for music that otherwise would be, it's sort of it's building on the tropes of things like hard rock and punk rock, right? Yes. But then it mixes it with this sort of weird, I guess it's telling that someone like Susie and the Banshees were influenced by German expressionism and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It feels like it's, and like you said, this band, Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry, you'd think they're German, because it's got that weird expressionistic take to rock music where you almost...
Machinistic.
And you almost can't believe that they're making this music with traditional rock instruments. It's just like
Yeah, it seems like it would be like from a synthesizer. If you think about it.
Yeah, just like they make a weird texture out of the sort of sound. These sort of bands preceded shoegaze, which I guess did that to a fuller extent. Like,
yeah, ethereal wave is a weird bridge, right?
Yeah, ethereal wave is like definitely the more sort of soundscapey, like dreamy realm of this sort of stuff. Whereas this is definitely similar to Joy Division, got that foot in traditional rock and roll. But what I mean is, like, obviously if you listen to it straight up, you're like, clearly that's, rock instruments. When you sort of just like let it wash over you, the textures all interplay in such a strange way that you feel like it's like almost magic. It's alchemy. They're making these different sounds out of traditional rock instruments. It makes you reinterpret what rock music is in that modernist sense, like they're tearing down what rock music was and rebuilding it in these very peculiar shapes, mostly.
Yeah, if I'm playing this out loud in public and people could hear it, it doesn't sound like a rock band. I mean, it sounds like that sort of music derived from the punk world, but it doesn't sound like a rock band. Almost like a almost like electro punk act almost.
Sure, yeah. The drum machine helps with that, but it's strange that so much guitar still makes you feel like it's not guitar.
Playing Joy Division could still make some people think it sounds like a rock band or a pop band or something, depending on the song.
Sure, yeah.
But no, this is sort of like firmly in that. I mean, I guess it sounds vaguely industrial, but I don't know if it strictly fits those designated parameters. Into those informal parameters.
The goth rock, death rock world, post-punk was a brother sort of genre of industrial.
True, yeah.
They're like of a similar sort of kin.
Of course.
Not necessarily the same thing, but no. Yeah, you could definitely see where one would lead into the other.
Mm. And this is a very, very good album. And what I found interesting is that, especially for like the first few tracks, it was one of these things where I'd listened to this album and feel like familiar with the first song, the title track. It's one of the greatest songs of the 80s.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
They want to talk about the weather. Just what a vocal pattern. It's Joe.
It's a weirdly inspired song, yeah.
And then a lot of these tracks are instantly likable in a way that like not many albums are like this. You have to go to like Happy Mondays Bummed or a Gang of Four Entertainment to find other albums that are like immediately likable.
That's very likable.
Like there's not like that or that Omni album I was talking about on the second.
Yeah, that's a great album, definitely.
Like boom.
Yeah, that's like Modern Wire or something. Mixed with the things that have come since, the Wire inspired.
Yeah. I don't think anything quite matched the title track, though there were some really good songs on here, and I feel like they
the title track's the centerpiece. It's a bit of a shame it comes at the start, but like you were saying, that's just such a ridiculously good song.
But very, very good album in any case / instance. Red Lorry, Yellow Yolly. Do you know much about the history of the rest of the group?
No.
The albums they put out.
I haven't listened to the next few albums, but there was an EP or something the next year.
Looks like it was the year before.
Well, the year before, yeah.
Yeah, with the Scream on.
And I uploaded that to my old... Yeah, with the Scream, yeah. I uploaded that to my old channel, the first one I had, and someone commented who was a big fan. I'd never heard of the band. But he mentioned that one of the tracks was incorrect. It was playing the same song again, and apparently the record label that reissued this band and a bunch of other sort of death rock and post punk stuff, something called Cherry Red. They're pretty big, it seems. But apparently in the 90s they would screw up all the CD releases of all. They were notorious for doing that. And so, and it still exists to this day. It's on the actual official YouTube upload of this, that mistake is in the album, the same one that was on that EP.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy shit. It's you want to create inaccessibility for music. I can't believe that's the streaming standard for this album. Is a incorrectly transferred 90s version.
That's a real shame. Wow.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame. Yeah, so this album really needs like a proper remaster re-release.
Yeah, Dark Entries or Minimal Wave get on it. It
Yeah.
falls into your their parameters. I mean,
Yeah, I hope they do. That'd be nice because this album needs a better standard. With its sound, they've let it down.
Yeah, really good stuff. And I realized I was looking at it at the end today. This is on that post-punk mood chart, but I never really took note of it. Like I got into this band via
There you
yourself.
go. Yeah, I guess it's sort of like considered a sort of hidden gem, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on that list which still hasn't been like, I say uncovered or whatever. Like Milk from Cheltenham is on there, and like no one talks about that. I mean, that's very inaccessible music, to be fair.
Yeah, that's
the sort of music that becomes popular if it gets picked up by a certain prog crowd who went into RIO, like Henry Cow, Universe Zero, Acts Like My Bull.
Sure.
Or some of the weirder prog like Moving Gelatin Plates, or French stuff like who's the group I'm thinking of? Like Art Zoid, Magma too, but like Art Zoid.
Okay, yeah. All that stuff does have a sort of dedicated fan base.
God, yeah. I was mentioning Dark Entries and Minimal Wave before. Those are record labels that I'm aware of and I know by name at this point now.
Sure, and they're pretty new as well,
yeah. And the other record label I like to mention, along with Bruton Music, what I foreshadowed, is EMT Records.
Oh, fuck yeah.
The third CD put out by the EMT label was this from Cubism 2294. Here's a chameleon on the cover.
Shit.
This is the two most famous albums of the EMT catalogue are the two Woob releases, Woob 1194 with the Emperor Penguins, and Woob to the power of 2, Woob squared 4495 with the toucan on it. Two of my absolute favourite albums of the whole 90s. This is my favourite 90s music aesthetic in some respects, to be quite honest.
Sure.
I absolutely it's just the enjoyment I've gotten from that, along with like the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack.
Yeah.
Which is in a similar world though.
Similar world, definitely. Even that last album, the Brian Bennett one, that had touches of Donkey Kong music as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Donkey Kong Country music.
Yeah. And I kind of didn't want to just go over one of those two albums today, but I decided I'll give an EMT example, and the one I ended up falling on was this one, Cubism, because it is of more of the... this is, given the longer tracks partly, I'm considering comparing it to the likes of my first pick in this episode, the Harold Groskop Synthesis, in that it's more about... There are parts where it's clearly very upbeat, but it's almost like those are the moments of the prog crescendo in between sort of like softer sections, and they're very... I don't know if you can really call this club music so much as it is sort of like, I guess you call it chill room music maybe.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's more for a more kind of intellectual new age context. Like this is for people who are like writing papers or like studying things under a microscope or something. It's very sort of, it's intelligent dance music was a term that was applied to the likes of Aphex Twin. Although this is, I feel more sort of sophisto-meditative music, maybe. I really enjoy what the apparent intent of this music is and the actual delivery. I mean,
it's not as glitch as IDM.
Yeah, exactly.
It falls more a bit into the genres like ambient techno.
Ambient techno is the
is it?
That's mostly listed. Yeah.
Because it's like ambient techno, which is similar to chill room music and similar to IDM, and it's also similar to, like I said earlier, because you got Robert Christgau on your show and you didn't even put on the New York Dolls or something. But so it's lucky I sort of, I've grown to appreciate the finer things like jazz funk and 90s ambient techno, because like I was sort of amazed at the first album you had, like I said, was this like progressive electronic.
Yeah.
And the next one's like this like new age ambient.
Yes.
And then this is like ambient techno ambient or something, which
Yeah.
is another style of like IDM, and it's like they're all the different like exercises of ambient music displayed in it's various like sort of like effervescent evolutions, you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it went in so many different directions. It's not just Brian Eno.
Mm-hmm.
It's like ambient music sort of like as this album started, like you know, it's got such interesting like meditative synths and drum patterns as it's like you know just bass and stuff, and it's definitely harkening off club tropes,
Mm.
you know, and then because of that I'm like, but it's very like cleverly like done, you know, most typical club songs that are just appealing to tropes are very like they hook you in with some gimmick,
Mm-hmm.
but then as it's like tastefully building up and like building into a song, I'm like, all right, when are these like '90s? I don't know what machine made them, but you know the squishy, like snare noises.
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
And the second it started, I was like, man, this is like the most tasteful use of those snare noises I've ever heard. It's amazing how they did that. I was just like, holy shit. But yeah, nah, this album is yeah, it's great. It's yeah, it's just taking all the club tropes of its time and like you know sort of in an alchemical way, I suppose. Again, is like building this strange meditative music out of it. Like I find it fascinating that like another trope of this style of music, it's in all of it, is to have a sort of you know subcontinental like Indian / like Middle Eastern like harmonic chanting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, that's all over this style of music.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, to the point where they would try to put it in like video games and stuff. And this album, like it's interesting how they would use that. And so this album, sort of like maybe in that more philosophical way you were saying earlier, you know, this sort of style of this label is more philosophically inclined. They see that as a trope and find it interesting that this incredibly like spiritual, cultural expression, you know, human art, its fairly raw form, is you know, being used in a very populist form of music. And so they give it that, rather than as a gimmick, they use it in such a way that it actually evokes its initial purpose. You know, it's not just a sound gimmick, it actually makes you feel what the ritual sort of, you know, practices were used for in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's interesting that this album is just, it's, yeah, like, it's neat that it's like a sort of flowing piece as well. Everything sort of, you know, you don't get, it's not jarring in its sequencing, it's very like fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sort of, it feels like it's just one long piece in a way, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Which feels very deliberate and sort of along the lines of like those Woob albums, you know, very
Yeah,
similar.
yeah.
And yeah, the strange sort of, I guess almost like parody, 90s parody of like new age isms as well, with the presentation of the album cover, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and like the nature stuff, documentarian sort of style,
Yeah.
being used in like a psychedelic way.
Mm.
It's sort of their trope. And
Yeah.
yeah, this is definitely the art and the music intertwine in that way. You know?
Yeah, it's so gorgeous. Yeah.
Mm.
You know, and it's funny. This is the kind of music that, in the '90s itself, I don't think this sort of music was taken very seriously by the critics. They liked all this sort of
No,
very
I trashed it at the time.
miserable alt rock, or like sort of like, you know, new sort of like cross audience pop sounds in the United States, or you know, the world music boom. And this is the sort of music that you get from a CD at the newsagent at the time, you would think, because like half of a magazine maybe. It's like, oh look, well, this is the world we live in now. This is some cool music. This is, you know, you can play this on your computer. You know, if you have, I don't think computers had CD-ROMs, CD drives yet. I mean, in 1994, I'm not sure.
Nah, I'm not too sure.
This is when this was released.
Maybe the most expensive ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, I doubt it was standard. It was mostly, you know, hard disk, floppy disk.
Yeah, but yeah, it's one of those things where at the time it's like I guess it was considered sort of novelty and throwaway, but I guess now we can consider it like, and now electronic music is. I guess critics, the published music critics didn't take it quite so seriously at the time, but in terms of if you want to be a musicologist now, I mean, you have to take electronic music as seriously as, I mean, as pointed out before, at least by a friend, Oakshot, there's a spectrum of classical music which we can engage via, the sheet music and that sort of world of education, that spectre. But then there's a world opened up by electronic music, and how do you even begin to map and categorize the scales which electronic music allows? It's impossible, because so much of it, it's if classical music is based on, say, the capacity of a piano, then like how do you what's the gravity of electronic music? It's limitless seemingly.
Yeah.
And so I think that it warrants so much, and more people realize that as the years go by, and they start taking some of this stuff very, very, very with a sort of with a great curiosity, and so therefore the EMT label of the 90s looks back. People can look back on it now in hindsight as one of the most fascinating projects in the history of electronic music composition and distribution. And I think it's a bit unfortunate. Like, the EMT went bankrupt by the end of the 90s, and this may just be conjecture, but I did read a comment on the internet once. That's all this is. Recounting a comment I read on the internet once, that there are rumors that they took the money and ran. A comment on the internet said that there are rumors.
It happens.
This is not AOD. This is saying that this is AOD recounting a comment which is not even recounting what the commenter itself believed. Just rumors which the people saying the rumors may or may not have believed. So I'm just putting that out there for the sake of any embittered artists.
Yeah, it's confirmed they did it.
Oh, for goodness sake. Damn it, Robert, what are you doing? This is Robert. Let's go to Chris Gow's record guy and complain there.
Sorry, sue Robert Christgau for defamation.
Sue him in English.
Because why not? I mean, like, most of his articles are defamation.
Robert Fripp's going to sue him for the Ersatz shit comment in, like, 1970.
Well, yeah, no, and I also called Mama Cass fat. That was a bit of a low blow.
Yeah. I don't know if that's legal defamation, but it is sort of, like, I guess, considered cunty.
Yeah, I guess it's true.
If nothing else. Certainly cunty.
Yeah.
Or borderline cunty. Hey, borderline.
No, I apologize to Mama Cass. On behalf of myself, Robert Christgau.
more like a borderline apology.
Yeah, borderline. Oh, right, you want a segue? Of course. I completely forgot. Asylum Party. Borderline. Sorry, I don't own antiquated gimmick modes of transport from the mid-2000s, so I always miss the segues. I rated this album one of those icons back in 1989.
Yeah.
And I've sort of come around after all these years, you know. I probably first listened to it properly because it's like it harkens back to the In-Depth Music days, you know, that post-punk music channel.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I would have first heard this album, and it just reminded me of the weird, like, cold wave revival that was happening in Sydney around the same time. And I was like, what the fuck? This music existed in the 80s?
Cold wave revivals in people knowing about the older groups.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily newer bands existing.
Well, and you had, like, a few bands, like, because it was becoming popular, so... And they were, like, right on the cusp of it being sort of, you know, exhumed.
Yeah.
And it, sort of, they took the similar sort of production styles and, like, you know, fairly lo-fi and reverb heavy, sort of like weird ethereal, like post-Joy Division sort of style of post-punk, you know. Like, this album is and most cold wave from the 80s was from, you know, France, or places like Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany to some degree.
Yeah.
But it's very much a French thing as well, and this is a French band too, and yeah, they just sort of all the songs are weird, like sort of like churning ruminations and like strange, like weirdly dirge-like but dancey, sort of like melancholic chants, and it'll go between like French and English lyrics, and I just find it so interesting how like I don't speak any French, but generally the French songs are like the ones that have these like weird sort of like ghostly like essence to them. Like it feels like they're like almost like they're being sung by Darth Vader or something. Like there's this weird like deep vocoder sort of to it, and I guess once again it precedes something like say shoegaze. You know how that would have a sort of disembodied vocal style, but then like also, you know that like Peter Hook style of like laser bass, like this weird melodic sort of like laser beam sound. The person I've probably heard that's done it like half as good, or you know, come close to making something that sort of way, is whoever's the bassist for this band. They do it in such a a way that would make like Peter Hook proud. It's a shame that people haven't done more weird sort of extensions on that sort of style, or at least like having to a more original capacity. You know, most people are just sort of ripping off Peter Hook.
Well, I've often what's really cool about Peter Hook and New Order in general is they're a rock instrument group. I guess call it a rock band might be a slight stretch, maybe not initially with the movement, but they make electronic music via their club EDM music with those rock instruments, and not many groups have done that since. I don't know, maybe it's very difficult to do that.
Just people who are imitating them, like LCD Sound System or something.
Yeah, you have to be quite musically proficient. Like, do we know the track? You know the track, but people listening potentially, do we know the track? What's it called? Tubenberger, Straight Ahead, featuring Chrissy Hind, I guess as well. But that track could be performed. It's not entirely electronic, but that track could be performed with a rock band's instruments if they were proficient enough, and I think it would be sensational. And it cannot be the only example of one of these songs. So I just think, imagine like if that was your gimmick. I don't know any bands whose gimmick. I mean, LCD Sound System. They're kind of just doing New Order and like, but yeah, like that would be. I always thought that would be a fun. I thought that it's been 10 years, and for 10 years I thought that would be a great gimmick. Just like EDM via a rock band.
Yeah. I mean, you gotta.
You need a synthesizer keyboardist as well.
You need a good player like
a phenomenal like one of these like genius post-punk drummers or better.
I was gonna say you need Stephen Morris, who's doing like drum machine shit on a kit, which is very quick.
The guys who are that good tend to play in like jazz fusion. That's the thing.
Yeah, sure. As opposed to rock drumming,
Yeah.
But even then, jazz fusion's a bit more groovy with the drumming rather than the sort of mechanical, EDM. A very quick drum pattern.
I guess there's guys with a lot of technical finesse. They get to a point where they can perform a lot of other genres quite seamlessly.
Sure. Yeah, and drumming has become a strange niche as a skill where there are really weirdly talented drummers out there who aren't even in bands. They just do like videos on the internet drumming or whatever.
Yeah, just like percussion sort of. Education.
And I'm sure there's like a million like 12-year-old girls out there who are like better than most rock drummers were in the history of popular music at this point in time. Like, I'm sure there's and that's only one portion of it. Like, there's millions. It's strange how that works. Because drumming's a weird sort of like hobbyist thing as well.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, being in a band. Which is more conducive to the day as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm probably going to say this about all the albums that I picked today, but yeah, this is like one of the most melancholic albums ever. And it's strange that like mechanized, like almost dance post-punk music is also so like disassociative as well. It's because most of the other cold wave stuff is like very tied into, you know, more sort of like traditional new wave style of songwriting where you have like, you know, verse, choruses, and bridges
Hooks.
and middle eights and yeah, and hooks and stuff like that. Whereas this comes from like a strange like world of mechanized, um, almost like dance music, just with like a few like rock pop sensibilities in there, you know, and yeah, like one of the songs on the album is called like La Torment, and it's like it reminds me of like the Chameleon song Second Skin. It's like this post punk sort of like the post punk epic, you know,
Yeah.
like a 5 minute song that's like it like condenses a prog suite into like a 5 minute punk rock song.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
There's a few of those, and then like that one's a great example on this album. Yeah, no, this is an album. Since I first heard it, I was just like, this is genius. And so yeah, just fairly, just a big fan of it.
Yeah, I think this is really good, and the songs consistently have a. They're very. They rely on the. Sort of the same like guitar, strumming or sort of bass or drum. I don't want to call it a hook so much as a track to me or something else. What I don't know. Like it's just sort of it's less of a because a hook implies something like kind of like upping you into the music, where like it sort of maintains that dissociative distance from between enjoyment and sort of like passive contemplation, it's quasi meditative, and I will say I like those, and I wish I don't wish, but like I guess I would say I prefer post-punk. You mentioned the Chameleons groups. It's more of a weighty sound to the production. This is kind of more stripped back and like, you know, 4 instruments, and I mean I guess there's maybe synthesizer work there as well.
Yeah,
but, you know, it's fairly stripped back compared to some of the other groups, but like still very sort of punky, not art punky either, not like, you know, Magazine Wire and I don't know, Swan Maps. I mean, the art punky was sort of crazy. But this is very sort of very it's like organized, very good organized ramshackle going on here, and no, but it's very, very enjoyable. And I was curious if you knew much about the other 2 albums from this group, one preceding and one following.
Picture One is the first one.
Yes.
That album's pretty good. Not quite as good. It leans a bit more into like the songwriting, but it's the guys are fairly. I assume it's just one songwriter. He's got a decent sort of ear for like strange melody. The sort of like is sort of very like anti-pop in a way that became popular in like 90s alternative music.
Yeah.
That wasn't, you know, post-grunge or like commercial music, you know, like the shoegaze sort of stuff. So yeah, it's just sort of in that sort of vein. Whereas the first one's a bit more like, I guess, new wavy. It's a bit less mechanical, and a bit more melodic. But I haven't heard the next one though. What's that one called?
Oh, it's called Mir from 1990.
Or I think I might have started listening to it once, but I didn't finish it. And that would have been like years ago.
Oh gosh,
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting group. Like we were talking because we had Martin Dupont. Oh, see, Martin Dupont's. I much prefer the Martin Dupont sound. That very dense.
Yeah,
sort of like
well,
boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, and that's way more
cold wave electronic
and synth pop. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very synthy.
I appreciate this group. Don't get me wrong.
Whereas-
I thoroughly enjoy this thing.
Yeah.
Definitely.
This is a sort of in a similar vein because Martin Dupont are French, but Martin Dupont almost feel more German in a way, but like carry these sort of like French pop sensibilities into that sound, which is very neat.
Yeah.
Whereas this feels more like it's leaning to sort of like that depressing Manchester music, you know. I suppose the cold wave bands were looking to England for their inspiration. That sort of post punk scene, because their ruminations on it are fairly interesting. Whereas Mon Dupont feels more like it's looking Germany. But yeah, that's a great example of how sort of vibrant the scene was. You have two very different sounds that are considered like the same scene.
Yeah.
You know, it's just another one of these vibrant like world underground music scenes, definitely.
Mate. Yeah, UK is full of those. I think ever since the 60s epoch, the psych era, they've had to like kind of live up to these sort of like really interesting scene of guitar groups. You know, whether it be sort of Liverpool sort of Mersey beat groups, which led to the Beatles, and then obviously the British blues, the Stones, and then the psych bands after Pink Floyd, and or any manner of groups hovering around London in the 60s.
Oh, the 60s had so many different scenes. Yeah, it's crazy.
Culminating in these big, enormous psych acts post Pink Floyd operating out of London, or like gigging. Them big gigs are in London typically. One of these big groups is King Crimson, and then the other big group that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of big important debut albums, partially because the big prog release was the second album, but releasing a sort of their equivalent to the sort of Pink Floyd, Piper and Source of All Secrets, Van der Graaf Generator in 1969 puts out the Aerosol Grey Machine, which initially was going to be credited to Peter Hamill and Van der Graaf Generator, his band, but ultimately they decided, I think rightfully so, to title it, to credit it to Van der Graaf Generator, because at least 79% of the music on here is entirely Van der Graaf Generator's soloing or dense sonic capacity, because Peter Hamill's vocals and lyrics take up a small portion of the disc, I think.
Yeah.
And it's we know Van der Graaf Generator is one of the big sort of not one of the biggest as such, but one of the earliest, interestingly enough. There's not many, like 70s, see, we had In the Court of Crimson King in 1969, in 1970 had ELP's first album, and the Least We Can Do is Wave Through Travel, which is that Van der Graaf Generator album, and their third album came out that year as well. It was at Pink Floyd's Adam Heart Mother, and I'm sure there's a couple of other things I'm forgetting in there. Time and a Word by Yes is kind of getting in that direction as well.
Is Trespass 70?
It is, but that's kind of more acoustic oriented. That's kind of Anthony Phillips era.
Yeah.
Like Nursery Crime is the real prog statement.
Yeah, the more sort of like classical, bombastic sort of thing.
Yeah, because we got King Crimson Lizard 70 as well, and Wake Up Poseidon.
Yeah.
I mean, because they already had their big thing in 1969 though. So, but the point I'm making is VDGG. I guess if there's a big five to prog, it's like, yes, King Crimson, Pink Floyd, if we count them, we may as well, ELP, and Genesis, and then, like, you have Gentle Giant as, like, the honorable mention there. Not VDGG, even though they were very early to the game.
Yeah.
And I think it's because their 4 albums from 1969 to 1971 break up, and they come out back in the mid-70s, a few more albums. I don't think those albums are as interesting, but the first 4, I think, are pretty damn engaging, and I especially like the second one's my favorite. That's my big favorite of those 4 albums. But I really like this one as well, partly because I just like that psych music of the later 60s, and it's a perfectly likable pastiche of that era, but also because like Amagama and / Adam Hart Mother, it's a beautiful demonstration of where the psychedelic rock tropes kind of organically evolved into the progressive rock tropes, where these long extended jams, I say virtuosic, I could say virtuosic, but in this instance it's more quasi-virtuosic. I mean, they're fairly virtuosic, but they're not like on the caliber of like Yes or King Crimson, these guys. But the keyboard guy clearly knows what he's doing.
This album kind of reminded me if you mashed Genesis with the Soft Machines' first album. That sort of style of
Hope
prog.
for Happiness, yeah.
Yeah.
Kevin Ayers.
Like that sort of scrappy prog.
Yeah.
Scrappy prog is actually, like, while I was listening to some of the extended jams and stuff on the album, I'm like, man, there's a certain energy to this scrappy prog. Like, almost even like Trespass is very scrappy as well. When they do the bombastic thing, it's not as tight.
Yeah.
And there's a weird energy to that style. Like this all throughout this album, when it's not like the Peter Hamill sort of like psych folky sort of singer songwriter stuff.
Yeah, sort of like what David Bowie was trying to do at the time.
Yeah, similar to that. Yeah,
One of those folks.
And it bridges in with all this scrappy, like I guess you'd call it post King Crimson.
Almost like post Pink Floyd, maybe.
Yeah, Pink
Floyd. Because King Crimson just weren't. I mean, they released their album the same year.
Amagama has moments of like scrappy prog and like avant-garde as well.
Well, think about how they're thinking about how the Pink Floyd live shows would have been. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. They were probably fans, I'm sure.
Which Amagama is half of,
Yeah. Live recordings, of course. And that more sort of avant-garde sort of approach to performance.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's an energy of that, which I guess became lacking a bit later in more like formalist aspects of prog,
Yeah, the sort of intricacies of like by General Giant, by Power and the Glory, where you're like,
sure,
this is very different from sort of Iron Butterfly. Let's say.
Yeah, definitely. It went in various directions as well.
Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
But this is right at the start of prog. It's it's just got this I guess it's the energy carrying over from the psych scene. The sort of like strange British the like weird sort of 60s Union Jack like British hippie thing.
Of course, yeah, classic, yeah.
It's sort of like
Cloud9.
Yeah, it feels like that sort of era, and it's just so.
The Beatles, Twiggy, the
Yeah.
superheroes.
Yeah, and it feels like a sort of fresh, younger person's take on that. Like this is what they've been absorbing through their like sort of coming of age years, and and it's got moments of genuine like experimentation within the world of prog as well. Maybe because it was so early on, but it's funny that one of them, the title track, I guess like ELP were like, oh, there's already a honky tonk song in prog, but we'll do ours better.
Right.
But I was just like, man, there's something about like honky tonk piano. It's like the greatest sound in the world.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that's probably like my most contrarian take, but there's something about the like tone of it that's like very interesting.
You know, it's like some of those Mott the Hoople songs on the Mod album.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't really heard that album, but does it have honky tonk?
Oh yeah.
That's hilarious.
That old rock and roll piano, like
yeah, rock and roll piano is a bit different.
Okay.
Like where they just jamming on the chords.
Oh, it's not quite that fast paced. I'm not quite that up tempo. You got to hear it. You got to hear it.
Okay. But yeah, anyway,
like
that's
the track
just
Marionette.
and the title track is like a novelty song, similar to how ELP.
Yeah, it's something like it's like a weird cut, like a Small Faces album.
Yeah,
Stuck on Flame.
Exactly, because it's an example of that psych era.
Yeah.
And it's the shortest song on the album because the rest of them are pretty much like long prog jams.
Yeah, 4 minutes and such. Necromancer's 3 minutes. That's an interesting. Necromancer's one of the ones I like more.
Yeah,
that's such a classic pop, plausibly Tolkien inspired sort of ditty.
And like they'll have a long song about an octopus, I guess, as well.
That's the last track.
I wonder if Gentle Giant ripped that off.
I don't know. I mean, Octopus, I think, came from the fact that there were 8 tracks, which were kind of were of a different nature. This came before Roger Dean drew them in Octopus.
That's actually interesting. I never realised that.
Yeah. That's what one of them, I think Phil Schulman, I've read a quote where he said, like, we called it Octopus because it was like kind of, we had 8 tracks.
Yeah.
They were paired with one another.
That's actually really interesting.
And we told, I guess they would have told Roger that they were going to kind of call it Octopus, and so he designed an octopus, and then the American label decided to design a different octopus. Which is also a really cool cover. You've probably seen that, the octopus in a jar.
Yeah,
it doesn't suit the British. I mean, it's not Roger Dean kind of. That world is his aesthetic, so it kind of suits the music better if it's a Roger Dean cover. Yeah. But that's still a cool illustration. Whoever did the American release, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, no, it is cool, yeah. But the main cover is better. But yeah, for an alternative, it's one of the better ones out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, this the next album, I suppose, I probably prefer a little more. At least definitely.
I definitely prefer
first
that
listening because it's similar to. I don't know, like Dark Side of the Moon, like where there's these weird like sonic like experimentations, like electronics in it, mixed in with his like singer-songwriter sort of stuff, and like the psych folk, and like bits of like saxophone, and then like prog jamming and stuff, and it feels like a bit more refined. Like it doesn't still quite lose the energy that this album has. It carries over onto the next one.
Yeah.
But it's a bit more toned down and like constructed in a more experimental way.
Yeah.
And then it bridges a bit more naturally. Like they sort of figured all that out, how to construct a prog song, the architectural thing, I suppose, like Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
But yeah, this album is like the fact that it's a great like pairing, the two of the first album and then this one and then the second one, because you see where like the first sort of ideas come from, and then how they're like then utilized to their fullest capacity on the next one.
Yeah.
So they're a great sort of sequence.
And polar opposite, like lyrical content. I mean, when they sing about the necromancer in on Aerosol Grey Machine, it's almost like, oh, he's the necromancer, like, you better watch out, he's gonna get you. Whereas on the next one, it's about like, you know, this witch hunter on White Hammer, and it's intense. It's almost more kind of gripping and horrifying than some of the Black Sabbath lyrics.
There's a sort of levity to it, where it's like very existential.
Yeah. And then after the flood, like that's, and the Refugees lyrics are genuinely quite haunting too. For a kind of softy, if you will.
And he's all just like, like apparently
he's not the most acclaimed singer in the history of prog.
He's doing a weird
him,
like
yeah,
British folk thing, and it's like idiosyncratic, but it suits the music very well.
Yeah.
And I suppose it was the inspiration for John Lydon, because it does sound like John Lydon. And apparently he was a fan.
I've read that where John Lydon has claimed that when people talked about him hating prog, he would say, oh, it wasn't prog I hated. Like, I loved Van de Graaff Generator. I thought they were cool. Well, he felt like maybe they were an exception. He was more, I guess, Pink Floyd, and especially, you know, he had the famous I Hate Pink Floyd t-shirt, but then ELP was the one that he would single out in interviews when he talked about the trucks going across the states. This shit, you know.
ELP were the easy ones to point a finger at, because they were so like pompous, like with the infamous thing where they had to have like I think Keith Emerson had to have his piano on like a Persian rug. It's like tens of thousands of dollars. Like that.
How rock and roll, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess it was like that kind of classical sort of pompous world instead.
Van de Graaff Generator are more like that sort of British like working class folk sort of thing, you know. Yeah. It's not pretentious.
Yeah, they're a Manchester band for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's a very working class, like unpretentious take on folk and folk fantasy, like you were saying on this album. And then I guess like that's sort of similar to like, no wonder John Lydon liked it. The next one is very like punk in that sort of like, where has Britannia gone? You know, the 80s, what happened to England?
Yeah, that whole world. Yeah, really good, interesting little group here. Peter Hamill's got some fairly interesting solo albums as well. And I tend to think of VDGG as... I mean, people who are prog fans, obviously, they're huge fans of VDGG. But I think to some degree they may get slightly unsung. And certainly these first two albums, because people talk about albums 3 and 4 the most, but I like 1 and 2 the most, though 3 and 4 are pretty cool as well.
They are
for sure.
Unsung in the prog world, seemingly. Definitely, yeah. They should be...
just for the punctuality alone, right?
Yeah, and the creativity as well. It's like in a genre that...
No guitar.
Quickly became... it quickly became defined by certain paradigms, like, that were sort of antithetical to the idea of being progressive, you know?
Well, yeah, because even the Peter Gabriel Genesis sound is fundamentally a little bit of a pastiche of ELP/Yes, and I think Yes were trying to go for On Fragile ELP, because they brought Rick Wakeman in, and it's like, alright, you're like Keith Emerson, aren't you? Let's do this. Now, they were able to construct better... I think Yes did better, sort of, more accessible and sort of, you know, punchy songs like Roundabout and Long Distance Runaround, which ELP had nothing like those. So I would argue Yes did it better, in a way, and so Yes seem more original than they might be otherwise, you know what I mean? But fundamentally it is sort of ELP's sound, you know what I mean? That symphonic prog world.
Yeah,
obviously we wouldn't
they were the first to do it. Oh, maybe maybe King Crimson.
Well, just it's Greg Lake carrying that over, so
yeah, I do.
Well, you can say King Crimson, but
Sorry,
it really
I
gets
do
solidified.
forget that. That's definitely true.
Yeah.
Greg Lake is sort of essential to that. Like ELP isn't all the Keith Emerson show. It is like Carl Palmer and Greg Lake as well.
Yeah.
But it is definitely different though. Like there are touches of ELP on like Court of the Crimson King, but for the most part, like the songs like each go for almost a different genre in a way.
A Talk to the Wind is very much like the kind of thing you hear on.
That's like psych folk,
Oh, that too, yeah.
It's very of its era, and most of 21st century Schizoid Man is like a jazz jam. You know?
Like Canterbury almost.
Yeah, like a Canterbury thing. Yeah. And then you get the pastoral, like the title track. It's sort of. It's not one specific sound, and the second album even more so.
That's a great jazz
that's
rock sort of world.
That's like something else. Yeah, that's like
slightly underrated in the discography. That's an amazing album. That's top 5. Crimson.
Yeah, no, that's like a weird avant jazz album or something.
Brilliant stuff.
Yeah, or almost like avant Canterbury in a way.
Point, yeah.
But yeah, the ELP first album is mostly the prog when you think of prog, as opposed to progressive rock.
Yeah, even a group like Gentle Giant sound a little bit different. Almost like Gentle Giant were trying to outdo them because they thought they were better players, and they might have been. Like Gentle Giant are almost the most of those British prog guys. Gentle Giant are the ones who seem to have the most. Well,
they're pretty tight.
Like because like. The guitarist Gary Green doesn't seem as virtuosic because I don't know how he's virtuosic. Fripp's pretty virtuosic. You can't really beat that guy.
Yeah, he's very has a very like lateral sort of way of approaching the guitar as well.
Yeah, I mean the drummers. I mean I think General Drowned had a couple drummers, but obviously Bruford was the guy.
Yeah.
Of the prog set.
Yeah, he's got a very distinct style.
I think the most virtuosic bassist was probably Squire of them. Maybe Geddy Lee a little bit later, but I don't know. Maybe well, I just want to count Tony Levin later in King Crimson.
Yeah,
but he's American.
Tony Levin was pretty good. Squire definitely. He's got a very distinct bass sound.
Yeah.
He does it with a pick, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a very strange sort of noise out of it.
Yeah, like even though we champion punk a lot on this show, I guess it is punk of us to go around and say, but prog's actually kind of cool in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
As long as you're acknowledging that punk needed to arrive and sort of prog petered out. Like a lot of, we talk about films a lot on this channel naturally, and certain genres they peter out. The post Star Wars sort of space opera fantasy world building, it petered out.
Yeah.
That sort of blockbuster aesthetic in the 21st century with culminating in say something like Avatar 2 is actually like Night as Justice League or Dune is petering out. I haven't seen Dune 2 yet, but I mean in a good way it's petering out.
The main reason why I haven't brought out that much prog is because
it's been talked about to death.
I feel
shit on in the prog scene.
I feel there's enough of it on the internet. Yeah.
They're also canonized, right?
Yeah. So
So if we're going
to talk
about
Vandegraaff, like you were mentioning, not really.
This is more of a psych rock release anyway.
Yeah. They're sort of in that similar vein of overlooked bands that definitely do need to have some sort of reappreciation, or at least warrant a relook. I suppose I'm gonna own a piece of 21st century hardware and segue into my one.
I'd love you to, yeah, please.
Yeah, the
bringing it back home as well.
The apartments, the evening waits and stays for years. Man, this band is from, like I was harkening on earlier, from Brisbane. It's like this weird, peculiar music scene that happened in isolation in Australia. Yeah. And I guess these guys were pretty early to the sort of jangle pop alternative rock thing. And it took them a while for this album to sort of be released, but What year is it? 1985.
Yes. When was it recorded?
I'm pretty sure 1985, but they
Right,
were just like
they're from 78.
yeah. They were around for years because I'm pretty sure the main guy, I forget his name. He was
Peter Walsh.
yeah, okay. I think he was one of the founding members of the Go-Betweens, and they kicked him out pretty early on. Like I think he's on like their first single release, which is from like 78 as well. So yeah, like he's this guy that was just sort of peculiar, like sort of songwriter from that whole scene, the sort of scene that spawned bands like the Saints and the Go-Betweens, and like if I was gonna summarize this album in like a sort of catch-all comparison sentence, I'd say it's like Ocean Rain by Echo and the Bunnymen, but instead of on the ocean, you're in like a graveyard. It's like what the Monster Mash, that silly novelty song from the 60s. It's like if that was fully realized as an actual event, it would be what this album sounds like. This like strange, like sort of, the only way I could describe it is like haunting, it feels like, and it's sort of elaborated in the lyrics, but definitely mostly in the sound and the way the vocals are recorded, because the guy's like not a very good singer, but he has like a strange sort of drawl and like way of like they layer it in this like reverb that you get when you listen to these sort of bands live. Like when you see them live and the singer's not that great, they just sort of layer it in this echo, and it sort of gives a weird like when I listen to this album, I feel like I'm in the room watching them play it live. It's it's strangely like stripped back in that sort of way. Even though there's a couple songs that have, like I was alluding to, Ocean Rain, more sort of like a few orchestral arrangements on them. For the most part, it's like this sort of stripped back, like jangly, like post punk sort of gothic music, and it's weirdly like it's like if Hammer Horror was given like the Dark Knight treatment.
Wow.
Like when Batman was made into this hyper realistic sort of thing. It's like taking that sort of strange like country, sort of like the sort of, if you drive through Queensland, it's just this like flat, fairly like barren landscape, of just like that never ends, and it's very conducive to this sort of like I forget what it is, but there's a term for the fear of like open spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like conducive to that, where you feel like you're like anxious because you're in this wide open space. And so like at the same time as this sort of album evokes that feeling with its like at the same time as being like this sort of sparse like post-punky like almost like angular sort of thing I was alluding to earlier with like Susie and the Banshees and Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry. It sort of like does that along with this sort of overarching theme of just like almost just like being scared and lonely or something. And it's like one of the few albums that like I was saying earlier with this kind of punishment, there are all these like 90s releases and through the 2000s and 2010s that are like, say something like OK Computer is almost like the pinnacle example of it. This sort of melancholia in the sort of contemporary postmodern world being the central theme of a extended piece of music. And this is like, at least in my mind, like a authentically realized sort of take on that, Mm-hmm. That sort of like after, especially in popular music, 'cause so many of these people were fans of that like music from the hippie era, the late 60s. And when that whole scene sort of like petered off, for the rest of like the 20th century, most alternative music is like a more depressed take on that style.
Well, that's the jangle comes from the birds.
Yeah, that's in almost like a hauntological sense. Like jangle's almost like a nostalgia genre or it was at the time, you know. A lot of older people who were like, you know, in post punk and into first wave punk and stuff like that, they considered like jangle music that were being made by the half generation younger than them like a stupid pastiche of the 60s. So, but yeah, I don't know. I suppose they just took that sort of sound and stripped it back to like similar to punk, to its like sort of core elements, you know. Like Martin Newell would say, these crazy kids, what will they do? Like they took your music and they stripped it back and then filled it up with anger from the street. It's just like, it's sort of like, yeah, the Gen X, like, you know, apathy at the world that was destroyed from their childhood. And so that's kind of what this album feels like. What do you reckon?
No, it's really good, and it makes it, yeah, it's right, just from the image you see here, it does feel it's true, the album does feel like it's as implied, it feels like it's foreshadowing some 90s styles, which are very popular in Australia, and in some respects we hinted a bit earlier have a certain almost a kind of almost an early warning sign of sorts of this sort of music in Australia, either via feed time or via certain more depressive singer-songwriters or, you know, scientists or things like this apartments music, because it's, you know, it's, you know, the vocalist made me think of it's like Chris Bailey, if he was more contemplative songwriter, we could say he was a songwriter. Ed Cooper wrote the songs in the Saints.
Yeah,
but,
that's interesting.
Ed Cooper's more idiosyncratic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's the goat of the Saints.
More sort of whereas the Mr. Walsh here, he's more sort of soulful and sort of wants to tell a story and kind of get his emotions out, like Richard Thompson in the early part of this decade that shout out the bright lights, except I assume Peter Walsh is younger than son of divorcee sort of era Richard Thompson. I think this is really cool, and you know it's very sort of you know, like urban landscape sort of melancholia music, again, as I said, foreshadowing certain popularly American sounds of as in like considered American sounds of the 1990s, but it's really sort of fascinating and yeah, a good like it's effectively Australian, but it's not a sound that really took off in Australia, because the Australian sound was kind of mimicking the American sound after a while, so it sort of got lost and it doesn't really seem to have taken off in the way that it could have in this country. Sort of there's a sort of a distinctly domestic sonic trope, I guess.
There are a few of those bands, but they were so localized that they're like very obscure. Like there's one called Box of Fish. They had a compilation album in the mid 2000s called Invented Grunge.
Nice.
And you listen to it and you're like, yeah, kind of. It's from like '84. It's like live recordings.
Do you know much?
Sorry, yeah, what were you saying?
I was just saying, do you know much about the group's later albums from like 1990? They have 6 albums from 1992 until 2020.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard any of the other ones except for the one from 2016 or 17.
It says 15 here.
15, okay, yeah, because they went away for a while there. Yeah, and they had like a sort of comeback. And I heard that album, but they've had another one since then. 2020, yeah. Yeah, but I haven't heard their other albums. I'm sure they're fucking all pretty good, because the guy seems like a very talented songwriter, very idiosyncratic. But yeah, it's just another band to further explore. You know, there's so much shit out there. I think the '97 album.
There's an album from 97
It's called Apart. Yeah, that got re-released recently. So yeah, I might check that out, because someone's decided to re-release it. So at least they do sort of You know which place, of all places in the world, this band seemed to be most popular, even more so than Australia? Is France.
Oh wow.
How weird is that? The French love this guy.
Cool.
Like, I remember reading, like, I think it was just on, like, Wikipedia even, a few years back, that when that, Song No Spell No Madrigal, the 2015 album was released, some French reviewer gave it, like, the best score the magazine had ever given, and compared his, like, the guy, because I guess the band quit because his life was falling apart or something, and his, like, son died or something like that.
Yeah.
And then he, like, decided to finally come back. And the album's just full of that, like, sort of, like, melancholia. And it's really translated in a very evocative way. Very similar to this album. But the French album, the French magazine compared it to Odysseus going on his...
wow.
You know, the... what do you call it? The thingamajig.
The Odyssey?
Yeah, the Odyssey.
It's
and then, like... He'd finally... Sorry?
It's in his name.
Yeah, Odysseus. Yeah. And he finally gets home.
He was named after it before he'd done it.
Yeah.
They called him Odysseus, and then he actually went on the Odyssey. It's like, oh, that's convenient.
Yeah, well, of course. That's why they named him Odysseus, because it was prophetic, I suppose.
Oh, yeah, I guess that sort of thing isn't uncommon in that little world, yeah.
Yeah, damn it, Greece. But yeah, I find it hilarious that, like, some French magazine, I guess, were, like, such a fan of it that they, like, it is pretty heavy music as well. It does feel a bit like an Odyssey, but yeah, it's strange that, like, this Australian band is popular in France.
Yeah, and in 2015, right?
Yeah.
Interesting that. God, you know, it's a fascinating little outfit here. I guess there's I almost feel like one of these days I ought to kind of just devote my 5 picks to kind of domestic releases and just sort of get some either improve my knowledge of sort of kind of jog my memory as to what's out there and sort of get sort of releases out to the world. Not even stuff I normally talk about when I do infer these albums, like, I don't need to mention Cybertron or Severed Heads or Feed Time or Yantra de Wilder again. Words won't do that justice. I linked it in the description of the last video. But, you know, I can continue to see what's, you know, just R.I.P. Records bands, you know, like, they kind of speak for themselves in a way, I feel.
Sure.
But, yeah, I guess there's more out there I could talk about, almost without question. And I'm glad we have the apartments here to represent the country, where when it does release good music, which is an occasional occurrence, actually, fascinatingly.
Every now and then.
Yeah, you know,
especially the Ted Mowry gang.
Oh no. Because Australian music tends to sound like music from other nations, right? You know, it's, you know, Australia's popular music in the English-speaking spectrum. It's just, you know, like all our big, like what are the 5 big Australian bands off the top of our heads? Like AC/DC, Midnight Oil, In Excess, Tame Impala now, and God, in some respect, King Gizzard. But like, what would it really be? What would it actually the 5 be?
Men at Work.
Maybe.
Just because they had a number 1 hit in America.
Yeah, actually, that might be that. And like, I don't know, like AC/DC, Bon Scott era, I like them fine. Like, that's nice enough.
The next one, as far as Australian popularity goes, would be Cold Chisel.
Oh, within Australia, yeah.
Within Australia, but
even Midnight Oil's more within Australia, to be fair. But they have some popularity overseas.
I think they had a bit of a following on, like, college radio in America in the 80s. And I'm sure they toured, like, England and stuff, but I don't think they had a huge following there.
Nah,
it was more just Australia. Corny. And, like, and because it was kind of corny, like, American college was like, oh, this is, like, a goofy thing, you know? And Australian
idiosyncratic Australian new wave.
Yeah.
Australia ate up a new wave. New wave humour was, really lent itself to the Australian sort of idiosyncratic, surreal, but they don't know the word surreal sensibility.
Yeah.
Like Devo having a huge fan base in Australia made an absurd amount of sense.
Yeah, definitely. Especially at the time. That was sort of the sense of humour that was on Australian television.
I would argue that a lot of the early music of the Wiggles is informed by that B-52's Devo era of new wave, and that's maybe why I got into Devo later, because I heard those songs, the Wiggles songs, when I was really young.
Oh, mixed with, it's coming from the same place, because like those bands are weirdly artful and idiosyncratic, whereas the Wiggles, you look at the Cockroaches, their band before the Wiggles, and it's more like...
That's more like a quasi pub rock
they're
thing,
doing
isn't it?
It's like, you know how Devo are reinventing like 50s and 60s rock and roll or whatever, you know, and like tendencies of surf rock and things like that. The Cockroaches, the pre-Wiggles band, are literally doing like a pastiche of that in the 80s, as if they were people who wished they were doing that at the time. The best way I could like sort of elaborate on that is on that one album they have. They do a cover of Double Shot of My Baby's
Yeah, it's one of the
Love.
5 greatest songs. And the original, yeah.
Yeah, the original.
The Swinging Medallions.
The original's amazing, but yeah, their version of it, you're just like, oh my god, this is awful.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And the Wiggles is more
great.
in that, like, you know, rock and roll, easy listening, like almost like Cliff Richard as well, sort of like world. More than Devo. Like, the similarity is that Devo and the B-52s, they're taking that and doing like a weird postmodern, post-punk thing with it. You know? So maybe you're right there, where that's like a precedent for that.
I think it's like some early Wiggles, they incorporate occasional synthesizers in the songs and like just goofy voices coming in choruses and stuff. And then occasionally I listen to Devo and I'm just like, why is this familiar? Yeah, like some, you know, like like Mashed Potato or like
full of goofy shit.
Or Zardu Zap and like some of those early Wiggles things, pieces. But yeah, because all these Australian bands, like, they tend to sound like, you know, like AC/DC's, like, American rock and roll, and Midnight Oil is like that sort of big, sort of American and British new wave, like in, say, as in Irish U2 sort of thing that was taking off. And then In Excess is sort of the big music, sort of boring, like, later Simple Minds phenomenon and later U2 phenomenon.
Yeah,
and then
a bit of a stain.
Tame Impala's like post Neo Psycho 2000s, like Tame Impala or God forbid MGMT, things like that. And then you know, I can't remember what the fifth group you mentioned was, but even like In Praise of King Gizzard, even though I said with Petrodragonic Apocalypse they made something that sounded like it was from Australia, like this genre was invented in Australia, that genre's an American genre fundamentally. I guess Sabbath are British, but like all the stoner rock bands, I mean, not some of them are British, like Electric Wizard, but we associated with, like, you know, this American sludgy sound. And King Gizzard are just doing an Australian take on it, like AC/DC were doing back in the 70s with that typical bluesy hard rock of the time. And so it's not often you get unique Australian music unless it's coming from the First Nations, the Indigenous peoples. And it's a music that's so rich and it's difficult to incorporate within. But King Gizzard do it vaguely tastefully in a sort of throat singing manner, I will say, in a cool, like, sort of, you know, pantheistic magic sort of George Miller-y, sort of Salman Rushdie way. You know, you can incorporate Indigenous Australian mythology and culture in a playful, fantastical sort of kids book way, but if you do it in a more sort of you know, you can't do the equivalent of raga rock of that stuff because it's just stinky. It's because there's the colonial aspect just kind of makes it reek of a really kind of plundering and kind of grossness, I feel.
Sure.
At least that's how I would feel if I did it and how I'd feel if I heard that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I haven't heard a lot of that stuff and why a lot of that stuff hasn't been made.
Yeah.
Sort of like, I mean, people of Indigenous descent have made that sort of music to some extent, and it feels authentic, but I mean, that's kind of a given.
Yeah, well, there were a few, like,
Anglo
Aboriginal, like, new wave 80s bands.
The Yoffi Indie being the more famous example, I think.
Yeah, and the Warrumbie band.
Oh, sure, yes.
And, I think there's one called, like, Redstone or something.
Oh, yeah, I know that, yeah.
There's a few of them. I think one was called, like, Pangea or something. Oh, no, Gone Wonderland. Yeah, there was a genre at the time. They would just, like, take new wave rock and roll and mix it with, like, didgeridoos and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a bit more authentic than, say, like, you know, someone sort of, like, just being like, oh, put a didgeridoo on that, that'll sound cool.
Yeah.
You know, which is a bit distasteful, I suppose.
It's pretty, it's highly, it's not only kind of disrespectful in sort of kind of a polite society way, it's sort of, from their perspective culturally, I think it's sort of just sort of sadistic, frankly, from the perspective of those people, of the traditional custodians. And so it's difficult sometimes, especially in this sort of Anglophone world, to come up with really original sort of alien ideas. And when you try to poach them from other cultures, it can come across as very colonial and sort of, it's unoriginal anyway, and sort of gimmicky, frankly. Even if you look at it amorally, it's sort of gimmicky and sort of, it doesn't feel organic and sort of cohesive and fluid.
Are you segueing into your next one?
I'm making an attempt to kind of clumsily, I suppose, but John Hassel sought out to, and I guess with Brian Eno in tow initially, though Hassel was around beforehand, he had this idea of creating a new kind of music, which almost sounded like it was from a new undiscovered culture or even an alien species. And its first, I guess, the most well-known distillation on record was the collaboration of Eno, which is 1980's Fourfold Volume 1 Possible Musics. Hassel was going to collaborate with Eno and Byrne on My Life in the Push of Ghosts, but Hassel felt as though the album was going in too commercial a direction, which if you've heard Fourfold Possible Musics, that's one of the least commercial projects Eno ever worked on, and that's saying something. It's one of his best projects in my opinion, which is to say one of the best projects by anyone in music. It's one of Eno's best projects. I mean, but there's nothing else to say there, is there? But no, Hassel, so Fourfold Volume 2 was Hassel alone, and that's a really interesting release as well. And the reason I chose this particular release you're looking at here, The Surgeon of the Night Sky Restores Dead Things by the Power of Sound, is because it's a live release, and it kind of captures, rather than going for a specific piece and trying to champion it uniquely, I wanted to just have a sort of a wide spectrum of the kind of music which Hassel performs and the performances at certain live gigs, which he felt as though was most suitable to show off in this LP here, which the track names are Ravinia, which is the name of a festival they have in Illinois, and then next to it is Vancouver. I've assumed he's spliced two recordings together, and then Paris 1, Hamburg, Brussels, Paris 2, they all go for 5 minutes over, culminating in a 53-minute recording altogether, LP release. John Hassel's music is possibly the most effectively uncharacterizable in the English-speaking, not that there's lyrics to this music, but of English speakers making music, John Hassel's is the most uncharacteristic. You can't compare it to jazz, you can't necessarily compare it to even existing tribal traditions on this planet that I can think of anyway. You know, it's not like gamelan, it's not like indigenous music, it's not like Indian ragas, it's not like Middle Eastern traditional folk music. It's I don't know what you would compare it to. It almost sounds like the music someone would be trying to compose, if they were clever, that is, for an alien species in a science fiction film or television series. Which is to say, I wish the music in Denis Villeneuve's Dune sounded more like this than it did Hans Zimmer, and that always disappoints me, because I always felt as though to really immerse you in the universe, the music of Dune ought to have been similar to the music that the people in the people of this fictional world, this fictional future, would listen to. I think that would be more interesting. Maybe Villeneuve can put out a director's cut with that in there, because I understand that for commercial reasons the studio would be like, no, you're not doing that. I get that. I do. I just wish that it had a more interesting Hassel. The Hassel passed away earlier in this decade, so that was probably not a possibility, frankly.
Well, they could have cited the fact that Eno already did a song for...
Well, that's a good point. No, Eno, the prophecy theme in the 84 picture.
It's like, we'll just get a guy who...
I think they may have been pretending that movie didn't happen anyway.
Yeah.
At least they didn't get Toto back.
Yeah.
I don't hate Toto's soundtrack, but we don't need to get Toto back.
Yeah.
Hans Zimmer's better off than what Toto would have done now, that's for sure.
Oh, of course.
I don't even hate what Hans Zimmer did. It just kind of is wallpaper. It's just sounds like predictable blockbuster music, which Hans Zimmer's been doing since a long time now. I like his Dark Knight music, but that's the only memorable score he ever really produced, and that's kind of what set him going.
Yeah.
And then since then he did the sort of
Because that one has like sort of tension in it, or at least it was fresh for the time.
It's a vaguely minimal sort of like it's just like kind of like four like strings dun dun dun
Yeah.
dun dun. It's almost like Spielberg like Williamsian, you know what I mean? That Jaws sense.
Sure,
But then I guess Inception onward they were just like Inception's just got kind of vaguely stock but competent sort of orchestral.
I don't even remember the music in that movie.
Well, that's just what I'm assuming it is. You know. I'm kind of feeling, I've seen Inception a few times, so I'm assuming my memory's okay on that. So.
But yeah, the sound design on Dark Knight as a whole is really good. So.
Oh yeah, we like Dark Knight.
That's like almost half the movie.
But not Dark Knight Rises. We don't like that one. Fuck, go to Chris Allo and see a Tranquility to find out if you want a more entertaining takedown of it. But no, I think John Hassel has music here, which is, nothing's original nowadays. Some claim. I know a band like Visible Cloaks tried, and that was a good album actually. They're self-titled. It's really good. We're gonna listen to it again one of these days, you know. But so they could have done the Dune soundtrack, let's say. But the John Hassel, it's using non-electronic instruments to pull this off. I mean, that's extraordinary. I mean, it's all well and good to do this with computers, but it's another thing entirely to have done it still within the analog paradigm. And that's why I consider, of all the, because Eno's worked with a lot of individuals over the years who have kind of fascinating careers on their own, and kind of whom Eno made kind of more popular by their association of him. Brilliant pianist Harold Budd, who also passed away around the time Hassel did, sadly.
Oh, wow.
I suppose it was 2020, so it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
And obviously you had individuals like later on he's collaborating with people like Carl Hyde from Underworld, and in those two really interesting albums in the mid-2010s, J. Peter Schweim and sorry, just give me a moment. And of course, like this his collaborations going back. Obviously you got the Fripp stuff, but also obviously with Rodelius and Mobius for those two albums, Eno and Cluster, and After the Heat. But After the Heat's one of the very best Eno pieces of all time, I think. And he has an interesting collaboration with Peter Sinfield in 1979, that spoken word album, In a Land of Clear Colours. Obviously mentioned David Byrne earlier.
Yeah.
Daniel Lanois, who's the ambient free guy. He's one of the co-artists on Apollo, along with Roger.
And Roger,
yeah. And of course John Cale. That's an interesting one. Wrong Way Up.
Yeah.
Jar Wobble with Spinner in '95. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And
now this album is actually a classic. It's, as far as the ambient goes, it's a classic ambient album, but you know what I feel this world belongs in? It is a genre I was mining on RYM for uploads fairly recently.
Yeah.
Called tribal ambient.
Well.
Is that what it's labelled as? Yeah, because tribal ambient, like there's all this tribal ambient stuff. And I'm like, this is like the best music I've ever heard. How is like this being overlooked?
Yeah.
Which it sort of has, because it's all like very overlooked.
Would have been a huge amount of pressing to this stuff at the time.
Nah, not at all. 'Cause it would have been like similar to, probably sold in similar places to like new age music, right? Because it's tribal. It's of a similar like aesthetic, but it's fundamentally as music very different, because it's more percussive for the most part, but then also, hence the ambient. It'll like mix in washes of electronic music in with like various tribal traditions all over the world,
Yeah.
That's sort of like you were mentioning the John Hassel's whole philosophy of like fourth world or whatever. Is like meant to, is sort of the whole inspiration for the genre, I guess. Like there might be a few listings of it beforehand, but I guess he was the first one to elaborate it as a complete idea. Similar to like, Eno coining the term ambient, I suppose.
Well, I just want to totally interrupt. The first chronologically album listed is Hassel's debut, Vernal Equinox from '78.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, he's the tribal ambient guy, I guess.
There you go.
Yeah, no, it's a great like style of music that is just
Most popular in 1994, according to this chart.
Yeah, no, heaps of 90s.
Yeah, there was a
stuff,
world
isn't it?
music boom in the 90s, which I almost ought to have brought up during talking about EMT before.
And that was in a similar world to Woob and
Yeah.
EMT, yeah, definitely. But yeah, the only other thing that, like, I guess is similar to this style of music, but mixing with the ambient, is like that spiritual jazz, you know, like Alice Coltrane.
Yeah, Pharaoh,
yeah.
Cannibal around that time somewhat.
It is sort of similar, but this sort of takes those ideas and strips it back and mixes it with the ambient sort of philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this album is just a great. Like if somebody was like, "Oh, what's tribal ambient?" This would be like one of the first ones you'd have to point to. But there's so many out there, and like there's a few that I had uploaded that are seemingly like unknown as all hell that are just like classic. It's yeah, I suppose similar to like all the other ones all the other albums in the ambient vein you brought up, all different styles of it. The tribal ambient might be the most underappreciated, perhaps because it's the most like you know, the Eno style of ambient is a bit more like atmospheric and like non-distracting, whereas
Electronic, sort of like modern in the, like it's electronic music that's evoking the technology itself in a way, rather than this stuff. I mean, this stuff isn't, at least not exclusively electronic music.
no,
But I think sometimes it is in the case of, I don't know if we call it EMT tribal ambient, but obviously that's electronic music.
no,
And some of the other artists, I'm not sure how electronic or synthesized their work is.
because the tribal stuff is, yeah, it's like very, like it has percussion in a way that other ambient music does, and it's the repetitiveness of its percussion that like is meant to be the big hook into abstract thought.
Its ambient music has more in common with In a Silent Way than like Phaedra, let's say.
Yeah, sure. In a Silent Way is another sort of like, yeah, preceding sort of thing to it.
That is heavily electronic, obviously. Well,
Mm.
electronic keys and stuff.
Yeah.
Intensely produced as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's similar to like Alice Coltrane, I suppose. Sort of. Yeah, like. Because I suppose jazz went world music, and then after that, electronic music did, and yeah, the tribal stuff is just sort of like it's such a great sort of like sort of unexplored canon, you know.
It's a blessing, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much of it, and there's a great choice because yeah, this album's is a key sort of element to that whole movement.
Yeah. John Hassel's one of these artists who have one of the richer discographies. Everything, I haven't heard everything, but when I have heard, he's got albums from into the 21st century, up to 19 albums. I don't know if some of these are duplicates or whatever. It's like something like Live Remixes Volume 1 or whatever, but no, he's very cool, very interesting. He's one of these artists who their philosophy was consistently of a you know how some bands, some artists have a sort of a maybe a more to refer to them very informally, trippy period, and then they kind of settle down and get more normie and sort of boring. Well, John Hassel is one of these artists where it's like it's always in this sort of
Yeah,
just by virtue of the music he's making.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's a few people like that. Like there's another new age sort of electronic act I could talk about one day, like Gandalf. Or
Yeah, no,
like that.
yeah, he's trying to like wield the idea of music as a universal language, literally.
Yes,
you know?
yeah.
It's music that crosses cultural boundaries to the point of, like you were alluding to earlier, being alien. You know, it's it would have been the perfect soundtrack to Dune. It's a shame.
Yeah, the music of the different houses. You know, when we're on you know, Planet Caladan, the music that the house Atreides would listen to and sort of patronize, and you know, kind of sort of bring it onto Arrakis, but then have sort of incursions of like a Fremen music in the soundtrack. Let's say once we're getting deeper into the depths of the sandy abyss there, you know. But hey, I didn't direct the film, and look, I haven't seen part 2 yet, but part 1 was good enough that I won't ever feel the need to direct or do an adaptation, even if I had all the money in the world, just because I'm like, oh look, it's out there. I'm fine.
Yeah.
If it just Lynch's Dune existed, I might be like, ooh yeah, do I want to direct Dune? Probably. But these ones exist, so like I'm all good now.
Yeah, maybe in like 50 years.
No, even then, out of respect, I just wouldn't bother. I'd want to do other things with the money as well, but they'd probably only give it to me if I did Dune.
Imagine if they remade Lawrence of Arabia.
They couldn't. They couldn't do that. Like I say, how do you remake a period piece? You know what I mean? Like a historical film. Like it just seems sort of weird.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you can remake biblical epics, I guess. Just think about Ben-Hur, for example. But you couldn't remaking Spartacus even would be weird. You know what I mean?
I thought they did remake Spartacus.
There was a show, but it was like a bit different. It had sort of a different angle, sort of more like Gladiator.
Okay.
But if you tried to take the plot synopsis of Spartacus, like put it in another film, one, those sort of movies aren't popular anymore, I guess. And the movies that sort of Lawrence of Arabia is, the sort of epics aren't really in favour anyway.
You know what? Speaking of like mythological figures who like put their body, mind, and soul on the line for humanity, unless you want to.
Well, yeah. That plus music where you're kind of thinking, what genre do I call this again? And this is a band which had a group, a slash family tree slash cult, which had
cult is a positive.
Pioneered genres, but they were still identifiable as genres. They may have helped pioneer industrial music. We can still call it industrial music. They were one of the big. In an very odd and creative way, acid house acts in the UK, but we can still call it acid house.
Yeah.
Or demented aerobics. I don't even know.
Yeah.
Look, I'll get to that later. That's kind of a little vision I have in my mind. But
yeah.
What do we call Trip
whole...
Reset? Trip Reset is the most one of the most cyberdelic titles of a piece of art from the 1990s.
Yeah,
it's very
definitely.
on point, very sharp, creative, but not kind of going too far. Just good stuff.
It's a good
I like titles, and that's just a good one.
It's a good title for an album,
definitely.
Titles. And it fits the aesthetic of the music very well, and the overall philosophy of the music too. Yeah, definitely. It's
So what are they going for?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's like, because obviously, this is an album I came to a bit later in their sort of my listening to them, which was pretty much
in 1996.
I pretty much listened to their stuff in chronological order for the most part.
Yeah.
Like, heard a bunch of acid tracks before I heard all the 80s albums. But yeah, I came to this album a bit later, and I think it's considered like a bit of a late classic amongst the fandom of Psychic TV. The fairly small, still existing cult, I suppose.
Yeah. The Temple of Psychic Youth.
Yeah. But, this one's like I guess similar to something like EMT or like, the ambient techno world. It's got like the sort of digital production of that era, but it's like this weird sort of like, how, what's it called? Hypnagogic pop?
Hypnagogic pop?
Yeah, hypnagogic pop. Yeah, that strange like thing that happened in the 2000s that took the sort of aesthetics of like the psych era in the 60s and the like early 60s space age era. And sort of this album almost feels like it precedes that whole moment, like where within this world of like digital late 90s like electronic music production, they've like made these weird like sort of like space age like pop songs that are like heavily influenced. Yeah, it feels like it's like the whole 60s encapsulated into like one like late 90s sort of like chill room music sort of album,
Yeah, well,
it's
sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah.
Well, especially the Apollo mission itself, and the end of the 60s, because I was going to say, sometimes it reminds me of like a 60s throwback in the sort of late 60s psychedelia sense at times, in a sort of playful way.
Yeah.
Like the Brits were known to do that in the 80s, of course, and like some longer tracks on here remind me of the extended jams you hear during the double LP of Hendrix's Electric Ladyland album.
Sure, yeah.
And
I think he was a big fan of Hendrix.
I have no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And obviously there's one track has Homage of Sid Barrett in the title.
Yeah, and big fan of Sid Barrett.
Yeah, he was.
Brian
And
Jones.
they work. Excuse me.
Curtis.
I don't mean to disrespect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's part. Oh, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask. Psychic TV, are they based in America at this time?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure because they were still in exile for some whole other
Some
tomfoolery.
Yeah, it's a whole story.
That's
recounted here.
Yeah,
for time reasons, if nothing else.
It's interesting reading if anyone wants to read about the history of like Genesis Peerage getting exiled from England. Strange media as a whole. Yeah, that's why I don't want to get into it because it's a whole thing.
Mm-mm.
But yeah, this
I was going to say this the phenomenon we're talking about that this preceded is it mostly in America. Hypnagogic pop is considered the American equivalent to say what Reynolds and Fisher called in the UK the kind of hauntological phenomenon.
Yeah,
they tend to cite UK acts like the Ghost Box record label or Burial, but the hypnagogic pop I think was considered in retrospect at least the American answer. Countercurrent.
Yeah, definitely.
Concurrent. Equivalent.
And like hypnagogic pop is a pretty broad term. Like anything, it's more alluding to the philosophy than the specific sound. But there was a bunch of hypnagogic pop. There's a guy called Steve Rockwell, who was like fairly well known in that sort of movement. It's like a sort of cassette sharing world from that time, and it's like all this music that's like harkening back to the space age, and there's a lot of that in that sort of these weird sort of like organ sounds and stuff like that, and that sort of sound carries its way through this album. And like you were mentioning with the washes of like late 60s psychedelia and stuff like that, and overextended pieces of like both ambient sound, like found sound samples, and then like weird sort of like similar to your last pick actually.
Castle, yeah.
The sort of tribal ambient world of like strange electronic beats and stuff in tribal patterns and stuff. And at the same time there's this weird like the Psychic TV like ideas for songs and lyrics are always weirdly like witchy and mystical, you know. There's just
occult,
this,
like
yeah, it's very occult, and there's an interesting sort of like existentialism to it, you know, and it just sort of pervades over the whole like thematics of their stuff.
Mixed version seems so much damned fun, doesn't it?
Definitely, and especially when like you incorporate like that with the he had a strange appreciation of that 60s moment, you know, of creative outburst. And so it almost feels like this album's like a fully realized thing of that moment. And it's almost like a great example of like nostalgia in its literal meaning of like memory and pain, you know. And so it's like an adult fully realizing this cultural moment in like sort of the late 90s. And yeah, I guess it's essentially like the album cover getting swallowed by the great cosmic vagina. It's
which is the numbers of a clock on the side, and it goes up to 100. No, it goes up to 110.
Yeah, it's a very like.
It looks like a clock because what looks like a tongue or a slit. I'm not sure. I thought it was a clock arrow for a moment.
It's a very worthy example of like these the sort of like I guess Sgt. Pepper's idea of like an extended album piece mixed with that 90s sort of world of like, you know, it being an hour and a bit long, you know, a fairly like epic piece of it. Like all the songs are like about 8 minutes long, you know, these extended soundscapes. I think it's all like mostly the big mission statement about it is not only is there a song dedicated to Sid Barrett, but obviously the second track they cover, Set Control for the Heart of the Sun.
Oh yes, that's a track on Sourceful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think around this time Psychic TV were really getting into like that sort of 60s thing. And it doesn't feel like a pastiche. Like, for example, they cover Good Vibrations around this time. Obviously, it's not as good as the original, because that song you're not going to be able to top. But I like that they sort of do their own little weird take on it. And, yeah, this album, it's definitely like a classic of theirs. And it, there's something about their sound that, on a few records is the best encapsulation of what they're able to achieve is this weird for example, they've got an album from the early '80s. Their second album, Dreams Less Sweet, was the first commercially released binaural recording,
Mm-hmm.
which is something to do with like a 3D sort of sound. Like it's a like a sort of alternative to stereo.
Yep.
And this album, like some Psychic TV, really does warrant headphone listens. Because if you listen to this album with headphones, it's got such a the way all the sounds like coalesce. Like when you listen to it on a speaker, it all coalesces in a sort of more mono form. Whereas when you're listening to it with headphones, you can really hear all the spaces in between, and it creates an absurd like 3D, like cyberdelic space. You're literally within this like sort of like the biggest visual comparison I could give to the 3D sound effect they're able to produce is like that animation of Homer Simpson in 3D.
Oh, sure.
Going through that nether zone or whatever.
Yeah, the third dimension.
That's what they're through the third dimension. That's what their music sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's ridiculous. It's something that very few like industrial artists were able to do, or like in this sort of vein. It's honestly I feel like it's an achievement that has sort of gone overlooked in a weird way. It's such a commanding of that, and I think that's something like that. Like you mentioned in Hendrix earlier with Electric Ladyland.
Yeah.
Like Axis Boulder's Love has that sort of mixing as well.
Yeah,
it's in
true,
stereo, but like I feel like they were very inspired by that sort of like sonic experimentation that came from the late '60s, and really did realize it to its fullest degree up until that point. 1997, I think this album is. Six.
Oh, yeah. So sorry. I think he's. Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
It's not that important. It's
96. Yeah.
Yeah, 96. Yeah.
Well, I did want to bring that up just briefly because it was released in 1996, 6th of February. And it says on Radio Music that it was recorded 1994 to 1995, so it almost seems to imply that there was a laboured period of working on this.
Sure, yeah.
2 years prior to, released early in 96, but, there's at least 2 years there when they were working on it.
Oh, and what day did you say it was released?
6th of February.
Yeah, 6266 or something. Like, they would release stuff with weird numerology in mind.
Okay.
Like, they had a Guinness Book of World Record, apparently, in, like, the mid-'80s for releasing 23 albums in a month. It was, like, 23 live albums on, like, the 23rd day. It was some weird numerology thing.
Oh.
Like, yeah, they would be that, like, literal in a weird way. It was very, ritualistic. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really good. And, Psychic, this is only the third Psychic TV album I've spent really significant amount of time with. Even the album that you were mentioning earlier, Dreams Less Sweet, God, like, that's some of that, especially when you get to, like, the nursery, like, that's, like, the kind of sort of music that Huxley could only describe that gets played for the infants when they sleep, during that novel's prophetic dystopia.
It is a brave new world.
It sounds like that's the sort of music that they were playing for those poor little infants. And if you want to know what that sounded like, listen to Dreams Less Sweet, particularly that track, as I was mentioning, the nursery. And of course, I was really getting into, when I wanted to listen to some acid house albums in certain, parts of my day-to-day life, I was getting really acquainted towards the infinite beat. And, like, they really nailed the genre, but not in the traditional sense of, like, sort of American Chicago acid house, or even the sort of stuff you hear on Pills, Fools and Bellyaches, for instance. But it's sort of sinister, horrific acid house kind of...
yeah, it's ritualistic.
Yeah, it's sort of like kind of enjoyably nightmarish. And I especially... Oh God, I adore the portion of the album where you go from just a horror house, it's just so brilliant, and the Jigsaw, Alien Being, and then the two track, they're not on the vinyl release, so I've read, but on the CD, so I've heard them. They're on my the thing I downloaded.
Mm.
But then the track Stick Insect, so brilliant. You gotta get your mind together. And then Money for E, just they're just superlative. And some of these tracks, especially like parts of like Alien Being and Jigsaw, it's like this sort of music is so revolutionary and edgy at the time. Like just the whole EDM world in general. This is 1990. This is all very new. This is like barely 5 years old in a lot of people's minds. People being aware of it as in a household, in the household dimension. But now we're in a world where like if I play this music out loud, you know, and if I say younger people around people born in the 21st century, and that they consider the music they listen to and hear the sort of music they listen to, you wonder, and I've pondered this before, is this EDM sort of house music world sort of considered dated to these kids? Does it sound antiquated? Does it sound like weird sort of like workout techno music to these sort of kids? Because that's eventually what that music was sort of really applied for. Popularly. So then I start considering like these sort of tracks like Jigsaw and Alien Being in the context of like, you know, because I imagine if a person was just walking by, they'd consider like, they're like, oh, you're listening to some like techno, and it's like, no, it's Acid House by the Temple of Psychic Youth. But there's it is kind of just that catch-all thing, like techno / EDM / music that people listen to when they're working out, kind of archetype. But what I loved about it is I was imagining like Jigsaw and Alien being used in one of those like, you know, morning television like workout like pro aerobic shows, and it's just so demented and culty and like creepy and hilarious, like just them trying to move to the sort of that initial the sort of when like Jigsaw like do, and it's just like they're moving like these weird like sort of like possessed puppets, like it's so funny, like it's just like
the real Monster Mash.
Oh yeah, it's just fantastic. Like we need to briefly you need to assist us here, like explain people the history of this sort of family tree, like the groups that this is all downstream of Frog and Gristle, but I think there's even an origin prior to Frog and Gristle, right?
Of industrial music?
Of these people, like isn't there like, weren't they operating as something prior to Frog and Gristle?
Oh, there's
like it's some sort of art collective, not necessarily a recording outfit, or was it always called Frog and Gristle?
Oh, well, it was called Coom, like Transmissions.
Yeah, okay, there you go. That's what I'm thinking of, I believe, yeah.
But what they're most well known for is Throbbing Gristle.
Yeah.
I think they might have put out a few live releases or, like, been bootlegs of Coom, like, live shows.
Yeah, and at this time it is the 4 core people in the group, which is Genesis P-Orridge, Chris Carter, Cozy Tootie? What's your last name?
Cozy Fantudi.
Cozy Fantudi, and Peter Christoph.
Yeah, Christopherson, I'm
yeah.
pretty sure.
Okay.
Sleazy.
and then it culminates in Psychic TV in a very seminal 1979 album, which is what they're most well known for now, 20 Jazz Funk Greats.
Yeah.
It may or may not be 20 Jazz
It's
Funk
Robin
Greats.
Gristle, yeah.
Yeah, it's Robin Gristle. And then we have the groups that are split from Robin Gristle, one of which is Psychic TV, which is Genesis and Peter Christopherson. Yeah. And the other group that split from Robin Gristle was Chris and Cozy, which is, of course, yes, Cozy and Chris Carter. But we also had Coil, which I believe was Peter Christopherson's group?
Yeah.
After he left Psychic TV in 1983.
Yeah.
And we also have to mention that Psychic TV was a split of Robin Gristle / they were referring to themselves as a Temple of Psychic Youth, as we, in some capacity, as we were mentioning earlier. So Temple of Psychic Youth meets a group called Alternative TV. Yeah. And so some people from Alternative TV, I can't remember their specific names. It was like a weird,
like avant-garde,
very interesting, crazy, no rules sort of group.
Yeah.
Think like Red Crowler or like
that's a pretty good comparison.
Really
Peer maybe.
Yeah, well, I think of Peer because they collaborated with Mario Thompson.
Yeah, that's what made
unusual results in that first album.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know. I think I have a breaking point actually, but but no, yeah, it was such an interesting, Frog and Gristle, kind of splitting into things like
Chris and Cozy was the other one.
Yeah, I mentioned.
You did, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I'm kind of missing here.
Oh, there's a few like
Obviously, they all might have even solo releases. You know.
Oh, there's a bunch because like Psychic TV were like a collective. So there's a few of these groups like there's a guy called like John Tibet or something. I'm pretty sure he had a group called Current 93.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They put out a bunch of stuff. His albums. And then there was apparently there's a really cool group called the Hafler Trio who make similar sort of weird industrial noise sound collage music, and apparently they collaborated with Psychic TV.
Yeah.
Because it was like a collective. There's they collaborated with heaps of people, sort of you know. It really was a sort of cult, and the whole like sound, you know, it was the more industrial end of like the sort of tribal ambient world, you know.
Yeah, like just trying to double check like what sort of who was in which group. So Coil was definitely Christoph. Oh yeah, Coil was
Yeah,
Christoph,
and
so
a guy called like John Balance.
Yeah, I think John he was he in Psychic TV? No.
No, I forget the guy.
Oh no, it says he has collaborated with Psychic TV and Current 93. I mean, you know, and Nurse's Wound. That's another little.
Yeah, they're another band in that scene
Steve
too.
Yeah.
There's heaps of these bands, and most of them good. Like, I'm surprised the Hafler Trio haven't been like re-emerged because they're really out there, avant-garde and interesting. But yeah, it's a whole nother world of sort of underappreciated music. Obviously, it's understandable why it's not popular music, but you know.
Another one worth mentioning. We mentioned them on the Milk from Cheltenham show segment on one of the previous shows. We mentioned a few of these acts, but Lemon Kittens and the two people from them, two famous people from them, famous-ish. Mark Perry,
Dax,
who's from Alternative TV / Psychic TV, and Danielle Dax, as you said.
Yeah,
Lemon Kittens. I know their work, or in particular, We Buy a Hammer for Daddy, more so than the Danielle Dax work. I've heard one of Danielle Dax's albums. We liked one of those, right?
Oh, Popeyes is good. Yeah.
Yeah, Popeyes. I think that was it. Yeah, Popeyes. Yeah, that you can't mistake. You can't forget that image there.
Yeah, Popeyes is pretty classic.
Fun stuff. But yeah, it's one of the most interesting strains of music. Is that kind of throbbing gristle / before that coom whatever, like family tree. Like it's just without that, like in history, like if you kind of surgically remove it, like it's. I mean, their influence is sort of. They're just one of the building blocks of like all these like sort of aggressive punk as in after punk, but also I guess post punk. I guess but
like hyper modernist. It goes like beyond postmodernist. It's like
hyper modern is better. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like
It's not sitting outside of it and sort of just like with the little monocle going in the wine glass.
No.
It's more just like you just ultimately trying to just
they're
accelerate it.
They're so like I don't want to say material, but they're literal in their spiritual approach to materialism.
Yeah.
That they want to make their spirituality like externalized in the logos, you know. Which they managed to achieve in a similar vein, I guess, to the whole Led Zeppelin sigil thing.
Yeah, and it was easy to think of that in the pre-internet / early internet world because everything is on the internet, it's kind of like, well, where do you start? Like, do you start doing stuff in the real world to get noticed on the internet again, or will the internet just be like, oh, some stuff's happening in the real world, but meanwhile we're doing this on the internet?
Avatars are sigils. Like, in a less literal, abstract sort of way. So in a weird way, everyone is playing with sigils.
There's just a sort of, I guess, like, one thinks about why they might at least potentially yearn for that sort of Temple of Psychic Youth moment in the 80s and maybe early 90s is in the UK or wherever, is because there's a feeling like, the battlegrounds taking place, it's happening outside, whereas like now, like, I feel like, we kind of decided to kind of place all this stuff on the internet instead, and that's because it's out of convenience and amongst a few other reasons, cost effective, blah 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 and all that, but it can feel like less existentially adventurous, but it doesn't have to feel that way. Although I think that I suspect there will be this sort of potential transition back to an external / outside oriented world, or at least a fusion of the two, because I think that it's just going to there's going to be a certain particular rush of sensation which can't be captured by sitting in front of or around screens, which I think I think this will peter out into a sort of hybrid into the outside world where people are sort of like actively participating in local communities and scenes.
Well, it would happen if people.
And there'll still be an internet presence, like that's how people will know about them. But it will be sort of like, it won't be about like, you know, the internet won't be the focal point of it. It's like, like the internet will be just kind of sort of, I guess, hyping up that external sort of phenomenon or that ritual or happening.
Sure. I mean, I reckon that would happen if, like, people just didn't drive everywhere.
That's a great point. Sure.
Imagine if, like, you just didn't drive.
Hey, yeah, it'd be
it'd be a lot more like localized, you know, in sort of the way you're talking about. It almost seems like internet is the superior technology to the automobile.
Well, yeah, you know.
And we really need to sort of have a better, like, you know, transportation system or something.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
It's just like, I think driving everywhere has made people more isolated, you know.
Yeah.
Just as far as how patterns of human movement as a mass go, you know. Unfortunately, the internet's that, but it's in a more like psychological way than like physiological.
Yeah.
You know.
I guess one way in which like I could be potentially, I mean, it's playfully, you know, accused of being a traditionalist is that I'm not. Maybe it's just me describing my own personal preferences. To me, like, online interaction isn't a blip of what like face to face like human interaction and relationship building is, and like I don't consider it remotely the equivalent.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just me, but like I felt that way since I was like very young, and when this stuff was a popular idea amongst people our age.
Sure.
Like, and people said, like, people seem to think it was just as valid to sort of like get to know people online and build this friendship with someone. We only really talk online. Like, to me, it was just like either I couldn't mentally cross that threshold, or it was just like I don't know, like you know, some people talk about, you know, I've got this great friend, or, you know, we're friends, you know, we only interact online, we've never met, and it's like to claim that maybe it might be a bit of a stretch for me to claim that has no like comparison to say human relationships built in real life, but like to me it just seems obvious that it wouldn't, and I'm not saying it is, but like I'm just saying it, to me it seems like, from my subjective perspective, it seems like ridiculous, but you know, that's not really for me to say. Like, for other people, frankly, I don't really think anyway. But so yeah, that's why at least why I would kind of be very excited by things moving out into a more interactive real world community, which is kind of built from the internet, but sort of in seeking, as the internet lends its users to doing, in seeking sort of a transcendent sensation, will return to an outdoor ritualistic context, and it would be not traditionalist, but rather a more futurist pathos, which drives it.
Yeah,
I like to feel anyway.
The human brain hasn't been like wired to think in terms that are opposing to like geographical context, you know.
Not really. No, I don't think so.
And people just got to learn how to murmur again, like the birds, you know.
But we will do our best to do so.
So listen to R.E.M's first album and listen to the entire discography of Psychic TV.
It's a lot of albums.
Yeah, it is a lot of albums.
Have you even listened to?
No, I haven't heard every album.
Have you heard like any 21st century output?
Yeah, one album from the early 2000s. I can't remember what it was called.
What's that stuff like?
Yeah, it was pretty good. It is just the usual thing. But yeah, one day I'll finish their discography.
It's a lot of stuff,
There-
man.
There's so many albums, yeah. Like there's a bunch of live albums as well. It's all good. But yeah, there's this is definitely one of the classics in the whole thing. And there's quite a few. They go in a bunch of different directions.
God. Yeah, well, we've made that is the Mandala attempt to tackle the family tree of Throbbing Gristle, that whole little universe. I mean, well, once you've found out about that world, you're like, what the hell is this? It's like this whole it's like like a dimension you had no idea could have possibly existed, and you're like, how is this not talked about more? But like it kind of is, but it was invisible to you. It's just kind of like something that was always there, but you never really took much notice to.
Yeah.
'Cause I was aware of Throbbing Gristle and at least 20 Fat Jazz Funk Greats for some years before I was even too familiar with Psychic TV. Chris and Cozy I was aware of as a name, and I had a couple of people, probably yourself included, which were really into their stuff.
Yeah, they got some good stuff.
But and you see the name Coil around, obviously. But like, yeah, damn, like,
Yeah, Coil.
it's a whole like fucking way of thinking, and like a vague like fun cult.
Yeah.
As far as like cults go, at least. Like, geez, like it's I guess like these phenomena existed pre-internet, but the internet as lends itself to several things that we suggested just earlier. It also lends itself to this idea of icebergs. This was a pre-internet iceberg, and
Yeah.
the internet has allowed itself to navigate this iceberg. Attempt to, because
Yeah,
how many
'cause-
of us have? How many comment here if you have, and
Because
like,
people
let us
can
know
share
how it was.
all the obscure things. So, albums that maybe only had 100 pressings, you can find a copy of these days, which you would have never been able to back then.
No.
So yeah, it's definitely an iceberg, certainly, and and unless you're around at the time, you wouldn't have heard that much Psychic TV through like mainstream or music press. A little bit toward the end of the 80s, they were getting pretty big, but they were never going to be the Red Hot Chili Peppers or something.
Right.
Like they're the real version of like band like that,
Yeah, very very happy and feel great positivity generally to finally be able to state that the Throbbing Gristle family tree / Psychic TV has made their presence known. The Temple of Psychic Youth upon Mandala here.
Yeah.
And
join the cult.
On this moment of great wholesome pride for a change, wholesome. Maybe we can perhaps, unless there's anything else to share, sign off for the world tonight.
Yeah, hit it.
Thank you, everyone.
Who the hell built those missiles?
Join that cult. That's a fun cult.